Welcome to Mr. Geronimo, where true fear begins when the story ends. I've been going back and forth on whether to talk about this for almost 6 years now. Part of me thinks putting it down in words is a mistake, because once you say something out loud, you can't unsay it. People hear a story like this and they either think you're crazy or they think you're making it up for attention, and I don't want either one. But the other part of me, the part that still checks the tree line behind my house before I lock the back door at night, that part needs to get this out. So here it is. I need to start with some background so this makes sense. I grew up in Bemidji, Minnesota. If you don't know where that is, it's about as far north as you can get in this state without crossing into Canada. Bemidji sits on the south shore of Lake Bemidji, which feeds into the Mississippi before it's really the Mississippi yet, just a narrow stream you could almost jump across if you tried. The town's got about 15,000 people, a state university, a couple of gas stations, a Walmart, and a whole lot of forest in every direction. It's the kind of place where everybody either works at the mill, works for the county, or drives an hour south to find something else. Winters are brutal. I'm not talking 40 degrees and some slush. I'm talking 20, 30 below zero on a regular January night, wind chill dropping at past 40 below, and snow so deep you can lose a mailbox in it. I work at the Boise Cascade paper mill outside town. I've been there since I was 22, started on the floor running rolls and worked my way into a maintenance tech position over about 8 years. It's shift work, 12 hours on, 12 off, rotating days and nights. The pay is decent and the benefits are solid, and in a town like Bemidji, that's about as good as it gets unless you want to teach at the university or drive a plow for MNDOT. My dad worked there before me. His dad worked the lumber camps before the mill was even built. This part of Minnesota, that's just what you do. You work with wood in some form or another, and you hunt. Hunting is the other thing. It's not a hobby up here, not really. I mean, it is for some guys who come up from the cities with their brand new Sitka gear and their $3,000 rifles, looking to bag a trophy buck. But for guys like me, guys who grew up here, it's more like breathing. My dad had me in a tree stand before I could read. I shot my first deer when I was 12, a small doe on state land about 10 miles east of town. I remember my hands shaking so bad I could barely work the bolt on the .30-06 he'd lent me. That was a Remington 700, the same rifle I still use today, though I had the stock replaced a few years back after the original one cracked along the wrist during a fall. My dad and my Uncle Jerry built a cabin up in the Chippewa National Forest back in the mid-'80s, on a small parcel of private land that my grandfather had bought decades before that. I say cabin, but it's really more of a shack. It's a one-room structure, maybe 16 by 20 feet, with a wood stove in the corner, a plywood floor, 2 bunks built into the wall, a small table, and a propane camp stove for cooking. No running water, no electricity. There's an outhouse about 30 yards behind it that leans a little more to the left every year. The nearest paved road is County Road 39, and from there you turn onto a Forest Service road, and then you take an unmarked 2-track that winds north through the pines for about 3 miles before you hit the cabin. In winter you need 4-wheel drive and decent ground clearance to make it in. Some years, depending on the snow, you can't drive all the way and you have to snowshoe the last mile or so. I've been going to that cabin my whole life. As a kid, I went with my dad and Uncle Jerry every November during firearm season. After my dad passed in 2016, I kept going. Uncle Jerry's knees got bad enough that he stopped making the trip around the same time, so for the last several years it's mostly been me going up alone, sometimes with a buddy from work if somebody's schedule lines up. Now, most people up here hunt during the regular firearm season in November. That's the big one. But Minnesota also has a late-season muzzleloader hunt that runs into January, and some years there's a special management hunt for antlerless deer in certain units that extends even later. January 2020 was one of those years. The DNR had issued extra antlerless tags for our zone because the herd count was running high and they wanted to thin the does before a hard winter. I'd already filled one tag during November, but I had a second one for January, and I figured I'd use it to stock the freezer a little deeper. Venison stretches a long way when you process it yourself. I planned the trip for the second week of January. My shift rotation gave me 4 days off in a row, Thursday through Sunday, and that was enough time to drive up, hunt for 2 or 3 days, and get back before my Monday night shift. I wasn't expecting anything unusual. I'd done this same trip dozens of times, in colder weather than this, with worse gear than what I had. It was routine. The week before I left, I did what I always do. I checked the weather forecast, which was calling for highs in the single digits and lows around 15 below, with a chance of light snow Friday night. I packed my truck the night before, the Remington in its soft case, a box of 150-grain core locks, my Swarovski binoculars, the old Motorola two-way radios my dad used to keep at the cabin. I always bring a pair, even solo, because cell service is non-existent up there and I like having a radio on me when I'm in the stand just in case. A headlamp, extra batteries, my hunting pack with hand warmers, water, jerky, a first aid kit, a folding saw, drag rope, and my skinning knives. For the cabin, I packed food for 3 days: canned chili, instant oatmeal, coffee, bread, peanut butter, a couple of cans of soup, plus a gallon of water, fire starters, a Coleman lantern, and extra propane canisters for the camp stove. I had my insulated Carhartt bibs, my Baffin boots rated to -70, wool base layers, a blaze orange parka over everything when I was hunting, and a heavy sleeping bag rated to 20 below. I left Bemidji around noon on Thursday, January 9th. The drive to the cabin is about 45 minutes if the roads are clear, which they mostly were that day. It had snowed about 4 inches the night before, enough to make everything white and clean but not enough to cause problems on the highway. I took 71 north out of town, past the Paul Bunyan statue and the tourist shops that were all closed for the winter, past Moville Lake, then turned west on County 39 toward Black Duck. About 15 minutes down 39, I hit the Forest Service road turnoff. There's no sign for it. You just have to know where it is, a gap in the tree line between 2 big Norway pines, one of which has a blaze mark on it that my Uncle Jerry cut into the bark 35 years ago. The bark has grown over most of it, but if you know what you're looking for, you can still see it. The Forest Service road was plowed, barely, probably by a county truck making one pass to keep access open for loggers. I shifted into 4-wheel drive and took it slow. The road runs straight through dense jack pine for about 2 miles, then curves north, and the trees change to a mix of aspen and birch with some big white pines scattered through. This is where it starts to feel remote. Not, I'm 20 minutes from a gas station remote, but I could scream right now and nobody on earth would hear it remote. The houses and farms end well before the Forest Service road. Out here, there's nothing, just trees, snow, sky, and whatever lives in between. The 2-track to the cabin branches off the Forest Service road at a spot where a culvert crosses a frozen creek. In summer, you can hear the water running under the road. In January, everything is silent and white. The 2-track was unplowed, obviously, but my '07 Silverado with the leveling kit handles it fine in the snow. I followed the ruts from my November trip, though they were mostly filled in, and drove slow, maybe 10 miles an hour, weaving between the trees. About 2 miles in, the 2-track dips down into a low area near a beaver pond, and the snow gets deeper there. I felt the truck push through a drift that came up to the bumper, and for a second I thought I might get stuck, but the tires bit and I powered through. The last mile is uphill, a gradual rise through thick timber, and then the trees thin out into a small clearing, maybe half an acre, and there's the cabin. It looked the same as it always does in winter, buried. The snow was up past the bottom of the windows, and the roof had a good 2 feet of white on it. The outhouse was just a lump in the snow, with a peak sticking out. I parked the truck about 20 yards from the front door, as close as I could get, and spent the first hour digging out the entrance, clearing snow from around the stovepipe, and carrying my gear inside. The cabin was cold, maybe 10 degrees inside, which is actually warmer than outside thanks to the insulation my dad put in the walls back in the 90s. I got the wood stove going with some kindling and split logs from the stack under the lean-to on the north side. It takes about an hour for the stove to heat the cabin up to where it's comfortable, so I kept my coat on and busied myself unpacking. There's a routine to opening the cabin, and I like the routine. Check the stovepipe for blockages, check for mouse damage, set the lantern up on the table, fill the coffee pot with water, set out the food, arrange the bunks, prop the radio on the window ledge, load the rifle and lean it in the corner by the door. It's the same steps every time, and they're comforting in a way that I think only people who spend time in the woods understand. You're setting up your own small civilization in the middle of nothing, and every item you place has a purpose. By late afternoon, the cabin was warm, and I'd eaten a can of chili heated on the camp stove. I stepped outside to take a look around before it got dark. The sun sets early up here in January, around 4:30, and by 5 it's full dark. The sky was clear, pale blue fading to white near the horizon, and the temperature was dropping fast. My breath came out in thick clouds that hung in the still air. I walked the perimeter of the clearing, checking for deer sign. There were a few old tracks near the tree line to the south, partly filled with snow, probably from a day or two before. A set of coyote tracks crossed the clearing diagonally, heading west. Normal stuff. I noticed a raven sitting in the top of a dead birch about 50 yards out, watching me. It made that deep, hollow croaking sound they do, and then flew off north. I watched it until it disappeared over the trees. Back inside, I turned on one of the Motorola radios and set it to channel 7, which is what my dad always used. These are the old DTR series, the kind that run on AA batteries and have about a 2-mile range in open terrain, less in heavy timber. I always keep one on my belt when I'm in the stand, just in case I fall or get hurt and need to signal. The other one stays at the cabin. It's mostly a security blanket. There's nobody in range to hear me, but habits are habits. I turned it on, heard the familiar squelch of static, and set the volume low. It sat on the window ledge, its little green power light blinking in the dim cabin. That first night was normal, or at least what passes for normal when you're alone in a one-room cabin 20 miles from the nearest town. I heated a can of soup on the camp stove for a second meal, washed the pot with a handful of snow melted in a pan, and set everything neat on the shelf the way my dad always insisted. He used to say a clean camp is a safe camp, and even though he's been gone 10 years now, I still follow his rules without thinking about it. Old habits become traditions when the person who taught them to you isn't around anymore. I read for a while by lantern light. I'd brought a paperback I'd been working through, some thriller I can't even remember the title of now, and turned in around 9. The lantern made the cabin walls glow a warm amber, and the shadows from the stovepipe and the gear hung on the walls moved slightly with the flicker. Outside the 2 small windows, there was nothing but black. Not the darkness of a town at night, where there's always a street light or a porch light or the glow of a phone screen somewhere. This was absolute darkness, the kind where your eyes can be open or closed, and there's no difference. The only thing separating me from it was 2 panes of glass and some plywood walls. The wood stove ticked and popped as it burned down. Outside, I could hear the wind pick up a little, and the trees creaking. That's a sound you hear a lot in the northern woods in winter. When it gets really cold, the sap in the trees freezes and the wood contracts, and the trees make these loud cracking and popping sounds that can startle you if you're not used to them. Some people call them frost cracks. They sound like someone snapping a 2x4 over their knee. I've heard them my whole life, and I don't even register them anymore, usually. I slept well that night. Warm enough in the bag, no interruptions. Friday morning I was up before dawn, which isn't hard when dawn doesn't come until almost 8 o'clock. I got the stove going, made coffee on the camp stove, ate oatmeal, and geared up in the dark. By 7:15 I was out the door with the Remington over my shoulder, the radio clipped to my belt, and my headlamp on. My stand is about a quarter-mile south of the cabin, on the edge of a ridge that overlooks a hardwood bottom where the deer like to feed on the remaining acorns and browse. It's a climbing stand I leave strapped to a big red oak every season. Getting to it means walking through the timber on a faint trail I've beaten down over the years, though in January with fresh snow it's more of a guess. I followed my compass bearing south and picked my way through the trees. The snow was mid-calf deep, but the Baffin boots kept it out. The air was dead still and so cold it burned my nostrils. The thermometer on my pack read 8 below zero. I got to the stand, brushed the snow off the seat, and climbed up. From 15 feet up the oak, I could see the bottom spreading out below me, a white expanse broken by the dark trunks of maples and the pale columns of birch. The creek that feeds the beaver pond runs along the far edge, though in winter it's just a depression in the snow. I settled in, pulled a hand warmer out, cracked it, and put it in my left glove. Then I waited. Hunting in January is an exercise in patience and cold management. You sit, you glass the tree line with your binoculars, you listen, and you wait. The cold works on you slow, starting in your toes and fingers and moving inward. Even with the best gear, after 3 or 4 hours you start to feel it. But that morning was beautiful in the way that northern Minnesota in winter can be beautiful, if you're willing to be uncomfortable for it. The sun came up behind me, low and pale, throwing long blue shadows across the snow. A pair of chickadees worked the branches of a nearby birch, their calls the only sound in the woods. Around 9, I watched a red fox trot across the bottom about 200 yards out, its tail streaming behind it like a flag. It stopped, cocked its head, pounced into the snow, and came up with a mouse. I watched it eat, then it moved on. No deer that morning, not unusual for January. The does tend to move less in extreme cold, bedding down in thick cover and conserving energy. I sat until 11, then climbed down and walked a slow loop through the bottom, checking for fresh sign. I found a few tracks along the creek bed, does and a fawn based on the size, heading southeast. They were relatively fresh, maybe from the previous evening or that morning. I made a mental note and headed back to the cabin for lunch. That walk back is when I noticed the first thing that struck me as slightly off, though I didn't think much of it at the time. About halfway between my stand and the cabin, I crossed my own tracks from that morning. They were obvious in the fresh snow, my boot prints, spaced about 2 feet apart, making a clean line through the timber. But about 10 yards to the right of my track, running roughly parallel to it, there was another set of marks in the snow. I stopped and looked at them. They weren't tracks, exactly, not footprints or paw prints, more like, and I'm trying to describe this accurately, like someone had dragged a branch or a stick through the snow in a line. A shallow furrow, maybe 2 inches wide and an inch deep, running in a more or less straight line through the trees. It ran parallel to my trail for maybe 40 yards, then curved away to the east and disappeared into a thicket of young balsam fir. My first thought was a partridge. Ruffed grouse will sometimes run through snow and leave a drag mark from their tails. Or it could have been a branch that fell from a tree and slid, or the wind dragging something. There were a dozen explanations for it, all perfectly ordinary. I looked at it for maybe 30 seconds, shrugged, and kept walking. At the cabin, I ate lunch, dried my gloves by the stove, and spent the early afternoon napping. That's another part of the routine. Morning hunt, midday rest, evening hunt. Your body needs the recovery time when you're burning calories just to stay warm. Around 3, I geared up again and headed back to the stand. The plan was to sit until last light, which would be around 5, hoping the deer would start moving as the temperature dropped with the sunset. They often do. There's a window right at dusk when they get up from their beds and start heading toward feed. I was about 100 yards from my stand when I noticed something else. The furrow I'd seen that morning, the drag mark in the snow. There was another one, or maybe the same one. This time it crossed my trail at an angle, coming from the east and heading west. It was the same width, same depth, same strange uniformity. No footprints near it, no sign of an animal, just the furrow, like someone had drawn a line in the snow with a ruler and a stick. I knelt down and looked at it more closely this time. The edges of the furrow were smooth, not ragged like you'd expect from something being dragged. The snow at the bottom was compressed, not scattered. It didn't look like any animal track I'd ever seen, and I've seen a lot of tracks in 30 years of being in these woods. I followed it with my eyes in both directions. To the east it disappeared into the trees, to the west, same thing. It was perfectly straight for as far as I could see. I stood up and looked around. The woods were quiet, the afternoon light was already going flat and gray, nothing moved. I told myself it was probably a deer-mouse tunnel that had collapsed, or a vole runway close to the surface. In deep snow, rodents will tunnel just under the surface, and sometimes the roof of the tunnel caves in, leaving a line in the snow. That made sense. I'd seen that before. This looked a little different from what I remembered, but memory is unreliable, and I wasn't going to stand there in 8 below weather analyzing mouse holes. I got in the stand and sat until dark. Around 4:40, with the last light going orange and thin through the trees, I saw movement at the far edge of the bottom. 2 does stepped out of the cedars on the south side, maybe 250 yards out. Too far for a clean shot with the Remington in failing light. I watched them through the binoculars. They were feeding, heads down, moving slowly west along the creek bed. Normal behavior. Then something happened that I noticed but didn't fully register at the time. Both does jerked their heads up simultaneously, looked north, which was roughly in my direction but not directly at me. Held still for maybe 5 seconds, then turned and walked quickly back into the cedars. Not running, not bounding, just a fast, deliberate walk, the way deer move when they've smelled something they don't like but aren't quite sure what it is. I scanned the area with the binoculars but couldn't see what had spooked them. It could have been my scent, though the wind was in my face, blowing from the south. Could have been a coyote in the brush I couldn't see. Could have been anything. I waited another 15 minutes until it was too dark to shoot safely, then climbed down and hiked back to the cabin with my headlamp on. That evening, sitting by the stove with a can of soup and the lantern hissing on the table, I turned on the radio out of habit and set it on the ledge. For the first hour it was just dead static, the usual soft hiss of an open channel with no transmissions. I was reading my book and half listening, the way you half listen to a fan running or a clock ticking. Then, around 8, I heard something come through the radio. It wasn't a voice, not exactly. It was more like a burst of sound that lasted about 2 seconds, a low, distorted tone that rose in pitch and then cut off, like someone had keyed a mic and made a noise into it, or like a piece of electronic equipment had malfunctioned near a transmitter. I looked over at the radio. The green light was still blinking steadily. The channel indicator showed 7 point. I picked it up and held it to my ear. Static, nothing else. I keyed the mic and said, "Hello, anybody on channel 7? Waited. Static. Nothing. I tried again. "This is a hunter at a cabin north of County 39. Anybody copy?" Nothing. I set it back down and thought about it for a minute. These old Motorola radios are simple analog units. They're not digital, they're not encrypted, and they're not immune to interference. You can pick up all kinds of stray signals, CB bleed, other radios on nearby frequencies, even atmospheric noise under the right conditions. In the winter, temperature inversions can cause radio signals to travel farther than normal, bouncing off layers of cold and warm air. It was entirely possible that what I'd heard was some trucker on a CB 2 counties away, garbled beyond recognition by distance and interference. I didn't think about it again that night. I banked the stove, got in my sleeping bag, and went to sleep. Outside, the wind had died down completely. The silence was total, the kind of silence you only get in deep woods in deep winter. No wind, no cars, no planes, no human sound of any kind. Just the occasional crack of a freezing tree, sharp and sudden in the dark. Saturday morning, January 11th. This is the day things started to go wrong, though I didn't know it yet. I did my morning routine: stove, coffee, oatmeal, gear up. I was out the door by 7:15 again. The sky was overcast, a flat, low ceiling of gray that threatened snow. The temperature had come up a little overnight, maybe to 0 or just above, which sounds warm compared to the day before, but still means everything exposed to the air hurts within minutes. I headed south toward my stand, following the trail I'd broken the previous 2 days. About 200 yards from the cabin, I stopped. There were tracks in the snow around my trail. Not the furrows I'd seen before, actual tracks this time, but tracks that didn't make sense. They were roughly oval, maybe 8 or 9 inches long and 4 inches wide, and they were deep, pressed into the snow a good 3 or 4 inches, which meant whatever made them was heavy. They didn't have clear toes or pads. They looked almost like someone had taken a short piece of 2x4 and stamped it into the snow at irregular intervals. The stride was long, too, 4 feet between prints, maybe more, and the pattern was wrong. They didn't alternate left-right like a normal walking gait. They seemed to land one behind the other, like something walking on a balance beam, placing one foot directly in front of the last. I knelt down and looked at one of the prints closely. The compression was uniform, like whatever made it had come straight down with even pressure. No claw marks, no fur impressions, no drag between steps. Just these deep, rectangular-ish impressions in the snow, one after another, in a perfectly straight line. I followed the line of tracks with my eyes. They came from the north, from deeper in the timber behind the cabin, crossed my trail at a slight angle, and continued south into the trees. They were fresh, made since the last snowfall, which was Thursday night. The edges were sharp and clean, not softened by wind or sublimation. I stood there for a long time, probably 2 or 3 minutes, just looking. My first thought was a moose. Moose are the biggest animal in these woods, and a big bull can weigh over 1,000 pounds. Their tracks are long and narrow and can look strange in deep snow because they sink so far. But moose tracks have a distinctive shape: 2 elongated toes with a dew-claw impression behind them in deep snow. These didn't have that. These were wrong. My second thought was a bear. Black bears den up in winter, but every now and then one will come out of its den during a warm spell. This wasn't really a warm spell, though. 0 degrees doesn't wake a bear up, and bear tracks are wide with clear toe and pad marks. These weren't that either. My third thought was a person. Snowshoes. The size was about right for a small snowshoe, and the shape could be a compressed snowshoe print that had lost its detail. But I was 3 miles from the nearest road on private land in the middle of January. Nobody comes out here. Nobody has any reason to. And snowshoe tracks still show the weave pattern of the shoe, or at least the frame outline. These were just flat impressions. I looked north, back toward the cabin. I looked south, where the tracks headed into the timber. I saw nothing, heard nothing. The woods were still, the kind of still that feels heavy, like the air itself is holding its breath. I unslung the Remington from my shoulder and held it across my chest, my right hand near the trigger guard. I wasn't afraid, not yet. I was confused and alert, which is different. In the woods, confusion can be more dangerous than fear because it means you don't know what you're dealing with. When you know it's a bear, you know what to do. When you know it's a person, you know what to do. When you don't know, you stay alert and you keep your eyes open and you don't do anything stupid. I decided to keep going to my stand. Whatever had made the tracks was gone. The prints were already a few hours old at least, based on the very slight softening of the edges from the air temperature. I walked to the stand, climbed up, and sat. I climbed up into my stand and settled in. The oak was cold against my back even through the layers. I could feel the metal of the climbing stand conducting the temperature straight through my boots. I positioned the Remington across my lap, adjusted the binocular strap, and started my usual routine. Slow scan left to right, check the open bottom below, glass the far tree line, check the closer brush for movement, repeat. Every few minutes, I'd shift my weight to keep blood moving to my toes. The hand warmers in my gloves were working, but the cold still found ways in, through the zipper of my coat, up the gap at the back of my neck, into the bridge of my nose where the air hit bare skin. That morning's hunt was different from the day before. Not because of what I saw, I didn't see any deer, but because of what I felt. The woods felt different. I can't describe it better than that. It's the kind of thing that sounds foolish when you say it out loud, but anyone who's spent real time in wild places knows what I mean. Sometimes the woods feel alive and busy and normal, with birds calling and squirrels chattering and the whole ecosystem humming along. And sometimes the woods feel like something has pressed the mute button. No birds, no squirrels, no chickadees, no ravens, no sound at all except the occasional creak of a branch under snow weight. Just silence. Thick, deep, unnatural silence. That's what Saturday morning felt like. I sat in my stand for 3 hours, and I did not hear a single bird. I did not see a single animal. The bottom below me, which had showed deer tracks and fox tracks and all kinds of sign the day before, was empty. Nothing moved. The overcast sky seemed to press down on the trees like a lid on a pot. Around 10 o'clock I heard something. It came from the north, from the direction of the cabin, and it was faint enough that at first I thought I was imagining it. A sound like, "The closest I can come is like someone running a wet finger around the rim of a glass." A low, sustained tone, barely on the edge of hearing. It lasted maybe 10 seconds, then stopped. Then, about a minute later, it came again. Same tone, same duration, then silence. I held perfectly still in the stand and listened. It didn't come again. I waited another 30 minutes, heard nothing more, and decided to head back to the cabin early. Something about that morning just felt off, and I've been in the woods long enough to respect that feeling even when I can't explain it. On the walk back, I found more of the strange tracks. They were everywhere, and I mean everywhere, not clustered in one spot the way you'd find a feeding area or a bedding area, but spread through the timber across a wide area. They were not in a random pattern like you'd see from an animal browsing or foraging, but in deliberate lines, straight lines, curved lines, lines that circled around specific trees. I counted at least 4 separate trails of the tracks, all in the area between my stand and the cabin. Some of them crossed my own trail. One set ran parallel to my boot prints for about 60 yards, maybe 15 feet to the left, matching my path through the trees step for step. I stopped and really looked this time. I got down on one knee and examined the tracks the way you'd examine evidence. The prints were consistent, same size, same shape, same depth, same spacing. They were all fresh, made within the last 12 to 18 hours based on the snowfall timing. And there was something else I noticed that I hadn't caught before. The snow between the prints was undisturbed. When a person or an animal walks through snow, they kick up little sprays and scuffs between each step. These tracks had none of that. Each print was clean, isolated, stamped into otherwise perfect snow. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. That's a real physical response, not a figure of speech. The skin at the base of my skull tightened, and I could feel each individual hair lift under my cap. I stood up slowly and did a full 360-degree scan of the trees around me. Nothing. Just timber and snow and gray sky. I walked back to the cabin faster than I normally would. Inside, I locked the door, which is just a simple latch, nothing that would stop anything determined, and built the stove fire up higher than necessary. I sat at the table and tried to think it through logically. Option 1, another hunter on the property. Possible but unlikely. My family's land is posted, and we've never had trespassing issues. Plus, the tracks didn't look like any boot or snowshoe print I'd ever seen. Option 2, a large animal I wasn't recognizing. Possible. Maybe a moose walking in a way I hadn't seen before, or a bear that had woken up early. But neither of those explained the shape of the prints or the lack of disturbed snow between steps. Option 3, I was misreading the tracks. Also possible. Snow can do strange things. Wind can reshape prints. Melting and refreezing can distort them. Maybe what I was seeing was ordinary animal tracks that had been altered by weather conditions into something unrecognizable. That was the explanation I liked best, because it was the one that meant everything was fine. I decided to go out one more time that afternoon and set up a trail camera. I have a Browning Strike Force that I use during the off-season to monitor deer movement, and I'd brought it along more out of habit than anything else. I figured I'd mount it on a tree near where I'd seen the tracks and see what it picked up overnight. That way I'd have proof, or at least a photograph, of whatever was making them. Around 2 o'clock, I bundled up and headed out with the trail cam and a bungee cord. I picked a spot about 200 yards south of the cabin where the tracks were thickest, found a birch tree about waist height that faced the right direction, and strapped the camera to it. I set it to motion detect mode with a 30-second video capture and night infrared. The battery was fresh, the SD card was empty. I tested it by walking in front of it and checking the playback. It triggered fine, caught me in a clear, bright infrared image against the white snow. I set it, walked away, and headed back. The afternoon hunt was short. I sat in the stand from 3 to 5, saw nothing, heard nothing. The woods were still quiet, that same oppressive silence from the morning. No birds, no animals, just me and the trees and the cold. I kept the rifle across my lap instead of hanging it on the stand hook the way I usually do. I kept scanning the trees, especially behind me, which is something you don't normally do when you're watching for deer in front of you. When I climbed down at 5, it was nearly dark. The overcast sky had thickened and the light was fading fast. I turned on my headlamp and started the walk back to the cabin. The beam cut a narrow white tunnel through the darkness, and everything outside it was black. This is normal. This is something I've done 100 times. Walking through the woods in the dark with a headlamp is not scary to me, it's routine. But that night, about halfway back, I stopped because I heard something behind me. Not a sound exactly, more like a change in the quality of the silence. You know how when you're in a quiet room alone and then someone else enters without saying anything, you can somehow feel the air change? That's the closest I can get. I was walking, and then I wasn't, because something in the back of my brain told me to stop. I stood still and listened. Behind me, maybe 50 or 60 yards back, I heard a single soft crunch, the sound of weight compressing snow. One step, then nothing. I turned around slowly and pointed my headlamp beam back the way I'd come. The light reached about 40 yards before it faded into blackness. My trail of boot prints stretched back through the trees, each one a dark hole in the white snow. Nothing else, no movement, no shape, no eyes reflecting in the light. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, listening, nothing more. I told myself it was a clump of snow falling off a branch. That happens constantly in the winter woods. A branch reaches its weight limit, sheds its snow, and the falling clump hits the ground with exactly the sound I'd heard. Perfectly normal. I turned back toward the cabin and kept walking. I did not hear the sound again. At the cabin, I made dinner and tried to relax. The stove was hot, the lantern was bright, and I had 4 walls and a roof around me. I should have felt fine. I mostly did, but there was a thread of unease running underneath everything, like a low hum you can feel in your chest but can't quite hear. I chalked it up to being alone too long. Solitude can play tricks on your mind, especially in the winter woods. I've read about it. There's actually a condition called cabin fever that goes beyond the colloquial meaning. Prolonged isolation in remote, cold environments can cause anxiety, paranoia, and even hallucinations. I wasn't there, not by a long shot. But I acknowledged that being alone in the woods for 2 days in January cold might be making me more alert and more likely to interpret ordinary things as threatening. I turned on the radio around 7 and set it on the ledge, static. I was reading and not paying much attention when, at about 8:30, the radio transmitted again. This time it was different. It started with the same kind of burst, a short squawk of static that was louder than the background hiss, enough to make me look up from my book. Then, underneath the static, I heard something that sounded like a voice. Not words, not clear speech. More like the cadence of speech, the rhythm and intonation of someone talking, filtered through so much distortion and static that the actual words were lost. It sounded like someone talking through a wall or underwater. You could hear the rise and fall of sentences, the pauses between phrases, but you couldn't make out a single word. It lasted about 10 seconds, then faded back to static. I picked up the radio and keyed the mic. Station calling on channel 7, I'm not copying you clearly. Say again? Nothing, just static. I tried again. Any station, this is a hunter in the Chippewa Forest, north of County 39. You're coming through broken. Say again your message. Nothing. I changed the channel, tried 8, 9, 10, scanned through the available frequencies, nothing on any of them. I went back to 7 and waited. At 8:45, the voice came through again, same pattern, static burst, then that underwater speech sound, then fade to silence. This time it lasted longer, maybe 15 seconds, and this time I thought I caught one fragment, just a couple of syllables that almost sounded like words. It sounded like out, and then something that might have been here or here, but I'm not confident in that. It could have been anything. I set the radio down and thought about it. The rational explanation was the same as before, atmospheric conditions causing distant transmissions to reach my radio in garbled, unintelligible form. It happens. Radio operators call it skip, when signals bounce off the ionosphere and travel hundreds of miles. With the temperature inversion conditions we had, extreme cold at the surface, relatively warmer air above, skip was definitely possible. Someone with a more powerful radio miles away could be transmitting, and I was picking up fragments of it. That's all it was. But I turned the radio off and didn't turn it back on that night. I went to sleep around 9:30. The stove was burning low. The cabin was dark except for the fading glow from the stove door. I was in my sleeping bag on the lower bunk, the Remington leaning against the wall within arm's reach. I fell asleep quickly, the way you do when your body is exhausted from cold and walking. I woke up at some point deep in the night. I don't know what woke me. There was no sudden sound, no obvious cause. I just went from asleep to awake in an instant, the way you do when your body's alarm system trips. I lay still in the sleeping bag with my eyes open, staring at the dark ceiling of the cabin, and listened. The stove had burned out. The cabin was cold. I could feel the chill on my face, the only part of me exposed above the sleeping bag. It was dead quiet inside, dead quiet outside. Then I heard it. From outside, from the north side of the cabin, the side with the lean-to and the woodpile, came a sound that I can only describe as breathing. Deep, slow, rhythmic breathing, but with a quality to it that wasn't right. It was too deep, too resonant. It sounded like it was coming from a chest cavity much larger than a person's. Each exhale had a faint rattle to it, a wet crackling sound, like air passing through fluid or damaged tissue. Inhale, hold, exhale with that rattle. Inhale, hold, exhale. I lay perfectly still. My right hand moved slowly out of the sleeping bag and found the stock of the Remington in the dark. I wrapped my fingers around it and eased it toward me without making a sound. The breathing continued. Slow, measured, patient. Whatever was making that sound was standing right outside the north wall of the cabin, maybe 3 feet from where I was lying, with nothing between us but 2 inches of plywood and some fiberglass insulation. I don't know how long I lay there listening. It felt like an hour, but it was probably 5 minutes. The breathing didn't change its rhythm, didn't speed up or slow down. It was steady and mechanical, like something that could keep doing it forever. I found myself unconsciously matching my own breathing to it, which disturbed me in a way I can't fully articulate. It was as if the rhythm was pulling mine into sync, the way a strong current pulls a swimmer. I caught myself doing it and deliberately changed my breathing pattern, taking a sharp, shallow breath to break the timing. My heart was working hard, pumping blood to my extremities, preparing my body for something that my conscious mind hadn't yet decided to do. At one point during the breathing, there was a faint sound of something pressing against the exterior wall. Not a knock or a scratch. A settling, like a body leaning its weight against the plywood. The wall didn't flex, plywood is stiff, but I heard the faint groan of the nails in the studs taking pressure. The same sound the cabin makes when a heavy wind pushes against it, except there was no wind. The air was dead calm. I could tell because the stovepipe, which rattles in any kind of breeze, was silent. Something was leaning against the wall of the cabin, something large enough and heavy enough to make the framing groan. And it was doing it slowly, deliberately, the way you'd lean against a door you were listening through. Then it stopped. Not gradually, it just stopped, mid-inhale, as if someone had hit a switch. One moment there was that deep, wet breathing. The next, total silence. I waited. 1 minute. 2, 5, nothing. No footsteps moving away, no sound of whatever it was leaving. Just gone, like it had never been there. I did not get up. I did not go to the window and look. I did not open the door. I lay in the sleeping bag with the rifle across my chest, and I waited for dawn, which was still hours away. I'm not ashamed to say that. I'm a practical man. Going outside alone in the dark to investigate an unknown sound when you're 3 miles from the nearest road and 20 miles from the nearest town is not courage, it's stupidity. If something was out there, I was better off inside with a locked door and a loaded rifle than outside in the dark. I didn't sleep again that night. I lay there and listened, and the silence held until the first gray light of Sunday morning started to filter through the cabin's small windows. Sunday, January 12th. I got up as soon as it was light enough to see. I was stiff and cold and tired, but I was also running on the kind of alertness that comes from a night of sustained tension. I got the stove going fast, more for the psychological comfort of the fire than the warmth, and made coffee. Then I took the rifle and went outside. The morning was clear, the clouds from the day before having moved on overnight. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, and the sun was just cresting the tree line to the southeast. It was cold. The thermometer on my pack read 12 below zero, and the air was perfectly still. My breath plumed out thick and white and hung in front of my face before slowly dissipating. I walked around to the north side of the cabin, where I'd heard the breathing. The snow on that side of the cabin was undisturbed. I stood there and stared at it. The snow was smooth, unbroken, covered with a thin crust of frost. There were no tracks, no prints, no marks of any kind. The lean-to and the woodpile were about 6 feet from the cabin wall, and the snow between them and the wall was pristine. Whatever I'd heard breathing outside the wall had either not been standing on the snow or had left no trace of itself. I checked the rest of the perimeter, walking slowly, examining the snow with the kind of attention I'd give to a blood trail after a shot. Nothing on the east side, nothing on the south side. On the west side, near the front door, my own boot prints from the previous day and the tire tracks from my truck were the only marks. The outhouse lump was undisturbed, the clearing was pristine. Nothing else had been there, nothing had walked up to the cabin, stood by the wall, leaned its weight against the plywood, breathed with that slow, wet rhythm, and walked away. At least nothing that left tracks, nothing that displaced snow. Nothing that left any physical evidence of its presence at all, despite the fact that the snow was soft enough to show the footprints of a mouse. I walked the perimeter a second time, wider, checking 10-15 feet out from the cabin walls. I looked for compressed areas where something might have stood, for scuff marks, for disturbed frost on the surface crust. Nothing. I even checked the roof of the lean-to, thinking maybe whatever it was had been standing on the woodpile and leaning over toward the cabin wall. The snow on the lean-to roof was smooth and unbroken, with a uniform inch of frost on top. I remember standing in the clearing, looking at the unbroken snow around the cabin, and feeling a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. I know what I heard. I was not dreaming. I was not half asleep. I was fully awake, lying in the dark, and something was breathing on the other side of that wall. But there were no tracks, not anywhere. I thought about leaving right then, getting in the truck and driving back to Bemidji and not looking back. But something stopped me, and I'm still not sure if it was stubbornness, or pride, or the fact that I didn't have a story that would make sense to anyone. What would I say? I heard breathing outside my cabin, and there were no tracks in the snow, so I packed up and left. That's not a reason. That's a feeling. and I've spent my whole life not making decisions based on feelings when it comes to the woods. But I did think about the trail camera. It was still out there, mounted on the birch tree 200 yards south. If something had been moving around in the night, the camera might have picked it up. Motion detect mode triggers on anything within about 60 feet. If whatever made those tracks, or stood outside my cabin, had come anywhere near that camera, I'd have footage. I decided I'd go get the camera, check the footage, and then decide what to do. That was the plan. Logical, careful, measured. Get data before making a decision. I ate a quick breakfast, geared up, and headed out around 8:30 with the rifle. The walk south to where I'd placed the camera was along the same trail I'd been using, my boot prints now a well-worn path through the snow. The morning was silent again, no birds. I was actively listening for them now, scanning the trees for any sign of life, and finding none. The chickadees that had been working the birch trees on Friday were gone. The ravens were gone. Even the tracks I'd seen in the snow the previous days, the deer tracks, the coyote tracks, the fox tracks, seemed to have vanished. The snow around me was either unbroken or marked only with my own boot prints. Except for the other tracks, they were still there, more of them now. I found them about 100 yards from the cabin, in the same area as before, the deep rectangular impressions in the snow, evenly spaced, in straight and curving lines that wove through the trees. There were more this time, many more. It was as if whatever made them had spent the night walking back and forth through the timber, covering the same ground over and over. Some of the lines crossed each other, some circled trees. One set ran in a long sweeping arc that I followed with my eyes for maybe 100 yards before it disappeared into the trees to the east. And I noticed something new. In several places, the tracks led up to a tree and then just stopped. No turning, no veering off. They went straight to the base of a tree trunk and ended, as if whatever was making them had walked into the tree and disappeared. Or climbed. I looked up. The trees above those terminal tracks were mature white pines, their trunks rising 30, 40, 50 feet before the first branches. The bark was rough and covered with a thin rime of frost. I didn't see anything in the branches. I didn't see claw marks on the bark. But something about looking up into those trees while standing in the tracks that led to their base made my mouth go dry. I kept moving toward the trail camera. I found the birch tree where I'd mounted it, and from about 10 yards away, I could tell something was wrong. The camera was still strapped to the tree, but it was facing the wrong direction. When I'd set it up, I'd aimed it south, pointing down the trail where the tracks were. Now it was rotated about 90 degrees to the left, facing east, aimed at nothing but empty timber. I walked up to it and examined the mounting. The bungee cord was still tight, still in the same position on the tree. The camera hadn't slipped, it was mounted firmly. But the camera body itself had been rotated on the mount, turned to face away from the area I'd been monitoring. The adjustment dial on the side, which controls the angle, was in a different position than where I'd set it. Something had turned my trail camera. I felt the adrenaline hit then. Not panic, but a sharp spike of awareness that shot through my chest and made my hands tighten on the rifle. I stood there with the camera in one hand and the rifle in the other, and looked at the trees around me. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. The woods were empty and still and cold. I unstrapped the camera from the tree and opened the side panel to pull the SD card. It was there, still in its slot. I had no way to view it at the cabin. No laptop, no tablet, no device with an SD reader. I'd have to take it home. But just knowing it was there, knowing that the camera had been recording whatever had turned it, made me feel something between relief and dread. Relief because I might have answers. Dread because of what those answers might show. I put the camera and the SD card in my pack and started back toward the cabin. I was walking fast now, not running but close, my eyes moving constantly between the trees, the snow, and the trail ahead. The Remington was in my hands, safety off, a round in the chamber. I am not a person who walks around with a live rifle and the safety off. That tells you something about my state of mind at that point. I was about 50 yards from the cabin when the radio crackled. I'd almost forgotten I had it clipped to my belt. It had been off since Saturday night when I'd turned it off after the garbled transmissions. But I hadn't turned it back on this morning. I was sure of that. I remembered specifically not turning it on because the sounds from the night before had unsettled me and I hadn't wanted to deal with it. But the radio was on. The green power light was blinking, and it was receiving. This time the voice was clearer. It was still distorted, still buried under static, but I could make out individual words now, or at least I thought I could. The voice was low, not deep, but quiet, like someone speaking from a long way away or through a bad connection. And the words, the fragments I caught, didn't make sense as a normal conversation. It wasn't someone calling CQ or giving a weather report or talking to a buddy. It was, I'm going to try to reproduce what I heard as accurately as I can, but understand that a lot of it was broken up, and I may have filled in gaps with what my brain expected to hear rather than what was actually transmitted. What I heard was something like, still there, been, watching, come out, come out. There was a quality to the voice that I keep coming back to when I think about it. It didn't sound like a normal human voice transmitted through a radio. Radio voices have a certain flatness to them, a compression that comes from the signal being encoded and decoded. This voice had depth to it, a resonance, like it was being produced in a space much larger than a human throat. And the pacing was wrong, too slow, with pauses between the words that were longer than a natural speaker would leave, as if the thing producing them was assembling each word individually rather than speaking in a continuous stream. And then, after a pause of about 5 seconds, hungry. The word was drawn out, the way you'd say it if you were tasting it. 3 syllables stretched into 5, and there was something underneath it, a vibration or a harmonic, like a second voice speaking the same word at a slightly different pitch, layered beneath the first. Then static, then silence. I ripped the radio off my belt and turned it off. My hands were shaking, and it wasn't from the cold. I stuffed it in my pocket and covered the remaining 50 yards to the cabin at a near jog. Inside, I latched the door and stood in the middle of the room, breathing hard. The stove had burned down while I was out, and the cabin was cold. I didn't care. I set the rifle on the table and sat down and tried to think. Okay, let's be rational about this. The radio turned on by itself, except radios don't turn on by themselves. But it's an old unit, 15 years old, been knocked around, exposed to cold. Maybe the power button was flaky. Maybe the cold contracted the plastic housing enough that an internal contact shifted and completed the circuit. It's possible, not likely, but possible. The voice. The voice was harder. Come out, and hungry are not things you hear on a garbled radio transmission from a trucker or a ham operator. But, and I kept coming back to this, I couldn't be sure that's what I actually heard. The signal was distorted. My brain was primed by 2 days of weird experiences to interpret ambiguous sounds as threatening. Auditory pareidolia is a real phenomenon. You hear noise and your brain imposes patterns on it, finds words that aren't there, the way you see faces in clouds. The voice could have been saying anything. It could have been a DJ on a radio station 70 miles away, and my exhausted, hyper-vigilant brain turned still on the air, been playing, come on out, let's party, into still there, been watching, come out, hungry. The brain does that, I know it does. But I also know what it sounded like, and it sounded like someone, or something, talking to me. I decided I was leaving, not in a panic, not throwing gear in the truck and fishtailing down the 2-track, but deliberately, calmly, packing up and going home a day early. I had enough venison in the freezer. I didn't need the second tag. The weekend was effectively over anyway. I'd hunt the afternoon if I stayed, then pack up Monday morning. Leaving now just moved the timeline up by 18 hours. It was the smart thing to do. I started packing. I moved methodically, rolling my sleeping bag, bagging the food, draining the last of the water. I let the stove burn down and closed the damper. I broke the Remington down and put it in its soft case for the drive, then changed my mind and took it back out. I wanted a loaded rifle accessible. I propped it by the door. The packing took about 40 minutes. I made 2 trips to the truck, carrying loads of gear through the knee-deep snow in the clearing. On both trips I scanned the tree line constantly. I saw nothing. The woods were empty and quiet under the flat January sky. On the second trip, I tossed the last bag into the truck bed and went back for the rifle and the radio. As I reached the cabin door, I looked south, out of habit, checking the tree line one more time. And I saw it. It was standing in the trees, maybe 80 yards out, just inside the timber line at the edge of the clearing. At first I thought it was a dead tree, a tall, narrow, pale shape standing vertical among the dark trunks of the pines. But dead trees don't stand inside a grove of living trees like that. They stand alone, and they're usually broken or leaning. This was perfectly upright, and it was pale, much paler than the surrounding bark, almost white. I stared at it. I was standing in the cabin doorway with one hand on the frame and my breath coming in short clouds, and I stared at that shape in the trees and tried to make it into something normal. A birch tree, maybe, its white bark standing out against the darker pines. A snow-covered snag. A trick of the January light, which is low and angled and can make shadows look solid and solids look like shadows. I wanted it to be a tree. I wanted it so badly to be a tree that I almost convinced myself it was. The way you can almost convince yourself a noise in the night was just the house settling if you try hard enough. Then it moved. Not much, a slight shift, like a person transferring their weight from one foot to the other, but enough to tell me it was alive, it was standing there, and it was looking at me. The distance was too far to make out details. 80 yards through timber, with branches and trunks partially obscuring the view. What I could see was this. It was tall, taller than a person, significantly taller. The top of it, the head, if it had a head, was above the lowest branches of the pines around it, which I estimated at about 9 feet off the ground. It was thin, very thin, the proportions of a person who had been stretched upward without any corresponding increase in width. And it was standing on 2 legs, not crouching, not on all fours, standing upright, still, in the shadows between the trees. I couldn't see a face, I couldn't see features. It was just a shape, a silhouette, pale against the dark woods behind it. But it was watching me. I could feel that the way you can feel someone staring at you in a crowded room. There was an attention directed at me from that spot in the trees, a focused, deliberate attention that I felt in my skin and my stomach and the roots of my teeth. I don't know how long I stood there, maybe 10 seconds, maybe 30. Time does strange things in moments like that. What I do know is that I did not freeze. My body moved before my mind fully processed what I was seeing. I stepped backward into the cabin, grabbed the Remington from where it leaned by the door, and brought it up to my shoulder in one motion. I held the rifle at my hip level, not aiming through the scope, just having it ready. Then I stepped back to the doorway and looked. It was gone. The space between the trees where it had been standing was empty. No shape, no silhouette, no pale form, just pines and shadows and snow. I stood in the doorway for a full minute, scanning the tree line left to right, breathing through my nose to keep my breath clouds from obscuring my view. Nothing. I swung the rifle up and looked through the scope, which gave me a much better view. I could see individual branches, bark texture, snow patterns on the ground. I could see the spot where it had been standing. I was sure of the location because of a distinctive forked pine just to the right. There was nothing there now. No tracks visible from this distance, though at 80 yards through timber I probably wouldn't be able to see tracks anyway. I made a decision. I was not going to walk over there and look for tracks. I was not going to investigate. I was going to get in my truck and leave, right now. I grabbed the rifle, the radio from the table, and my keys. I pulled the cabin door shut behind me but didn't bother latching it. I wasn't coming back anytime soon, and if a bear wanted in, a latch wouldn't stop it. I walked to the truck quickly, my boots crunching in the snow, the rifle in my right hand and the keys in my left. I kept my eyes on the tree line the entire way, watching for movement. The truck started on the first try. The engine was cold, and it turned over rough, the way a diesel does in extreme cold, but it fired. I let it idle for maybe 10 seconds. I know you're supposed to let it warm up longer, but I didn't care about the engine at that moment. Then put it in reverse and backed out of the clearing. The 2-track out was a tunnel through the trees. 1 lane, barely wider than the truck, thick timber pressing in on both sides, snow-covered and winding. Branches scraped against the mirrors and the side panels as I drove. I drove it in reverse for the first 100 yards because there was no room to turn around, steering by the side mirrors and fighting the urge to floor it. The truck whined in reverse gear, the transmission working hard in the cold. Then I found a wide spot where a logging spur branched off, made a 3-point turn that felt like it took forever. Forward, reverse, forward, the wheels spinning, the engine revving, snow flying, and finally got pointed south toward the Forest Service road. 4-wheel drive, 10 miles an hour, the Silverado pushing through the snow with the engine roaring and the heater blasting air that was only now starting to turn warm. The 2-track felt longer on the way out than it had on the way in. Every bend in the road, every thick stand of pines crowding the edges, every dark space between the trunks. I was watching all of it. The rifle was on the passenger seat, muzzle pointed toward the door, the bolt handle up where I could reach it. I kept one hand on the wheel and one hand near the rifle, and I drove. About a mile down the two-track, in the low area near the beaver pond where the snow gets deep, I had to slow down because the road dipped and the drifts were higher than they'd been on Thursday. The truck wallowed through, the front bumper throwing up sheets of white. I was watching the road, focusing on keeping the wheels in the ruts, when I glanced in the rearview mirror. Something was in the road behind me. It was far back, maybe 200 yards, visible in the straight stretch of the two-track before the road curved. It was on the road, standing in the center, in the tire tracks I'd just made. And even at that distance, even in the small rectangle of the rearview mirror of a bouncing truck, I could tell it was tall and thin, and it was not a person. It was standing perfectly still in the tracks, facing my direction. The proportions were wrong in the same way they'd been wrong in the clearing. Too tall, too narrow, the limbs too long for the body. It was pale, a washed-out grayish white that stood out against the dark timber behind it. And it was standing the way nothing in nature stands, perfectly, absolutely motionless, like a photograph rather than a living thing. For maybe 2 seconds I was looking at it in the mirror, and it was looking at me, and the distance between us was everything. I hit the gas. The truck lurched forward, fishtailed slightly in the snow, and I corrected and kept going. I did not look in the rearview mirror again until I reached the Forest Service road. When I turned onto the Forest Service road, I stopped the truck and sat there for about 30 seconds with the engine running and my hands on the wheel. The road ahead was straight, plowed, and empty. Behind me, the two-track disappeared into the trees. Nothing emerged from it. Nothing followed me onto the Forest Service road. I drove to County 39 without stopping, turned east toward Black Duck, drove through Black Duck without stopping, took 71 south toward Bemidji. It wasn't until I hit the outskirts of town, passing the gas station at the intersection where the Burger King used to be, seeing other cars on the road, and lights and windows and signs of normal human civilization, that I realized my hands were still shaking and I'd been gripping the steering wheel so hard that my fingers had cramped into claws. I went home. I parked in my driveway, brought my gear inside, and locked every door and window in the house, including the basement windows and the garage side door, which I normally don't bother with. I drew the curtains in the living room, which faces a strip of trees at the back of my property. Then I sat on my couch with the Remington across my knees and stared at the wall for a long time. The house was warm and bright and full of all the sounds of civilization. The furnace cycling, the refrigerator humming, a car passing on the street outside, and none of it felt like enough. I left every light in the house on that night. The electric bill was noticeable the following month. I didn't sleep well for about 2 weeks after that. Not nightmares, exactly. Just a reluctance to close my eyes in the dark and a tendency to wake up at 3 in the morning and lie there listening to the house settle around me, waiting for a sound that didn't come. My appetite was off. I went to work and did my job and talked to people and acted normal. And underneath all of it, I was carrying this thing that I couldn't share because sharing it would make me the guy who saw something in the woods, and I've known guys like that, and I never wanted to be one. I didn't tell anyone. Not that day, not for weeks. What would I say? I heard breathing outside my cabin and there was something tall in the trees? That's a story for a campfire, not a conversation with your buddies at the mill. They'd think I'd been drinking, or they'd never let me hear the end of it, so I kept quiet. But I checked the trail camera. The next day, Monday, I bought a USB SD card reader from the Walmart in town and plugged the camera's card into my laptop. The camera had captured 12 video clips between Saturday afternoon when I'd set it up and Sunday morning when I'd pulled it. The first 8 clips were nothing. Wind triggering the motion sensor, or snow falling off a branch. You could see the empty woods in infrared, the trees glowing pale gray and the snow bright white, and nothing moving except branches. Clip 9 was timestamped at 11:47 p.m. Saturday night. The camera was still aimed south at that point. It hadn't been turned yet. The motion sensor triggered, and the camera recorded 30 seconds of video. For the first 10 seconds, there was nothing. Just the woods, still and empty in the infrared. Then, at the edge of the frame, at the very right side of the image, something moved. It was partially out of frame. I could only see a portion of it, a vertical shape, moving from right to left across the far edge of the camera's field of view. It was there for maybe 3 seconds before it passed out of frame entirely. In those 3 seconds, what I could see was a section of what appeared to be a torso and one long, thin arm. The arm was extended slightly from the body, and it was long, disproportionately long. and it appeared to end in something that I initially thought was a hand, but looking at it more closely, frame by frame on my laptop, looked more like a cluster of extended fingers or narrow appendages, spread wide like a fan. The image quality was poor. Infrared trail cameras are not high definition. At the distance this thing was from the camera, probably 25 or 30 feet, the image was grainy and indistinct. I could see shapes, but not details. I could see movement, but not features. The thing was taller than the frame of the video, meaning its head was above the camera's field of view, which was aimed at roughly waist to chest height on a normal person. The section of torso I could see appeared to be narrow and angular, with visible ridges that could have been ribs or could have been folds in some kind of clothing or covering. It moved smoothly, not the jerky, bouncing gait of a person walking, more like a gliding motion, as if it were on wheels or its legs were moving independently of its upper body. It passed through the edge of the frame in about 3 seconds and was gone. Clips 10 and 11 were more nothing. Wind, branches, empty woods. Clip 12 was time-stamped at 3:22 a.m. Sunday morning. This was after the camera had been turned, so it was now facing east instead of south. The motion sensor triggered. The camera recorded 30 seconds, and for the entire 30 seconds, the frame was filled with something close to the lens. Not right against it, maybe 2 or 3 feet away. Close enough that the infrared illuminator was overexposing whatever it was, washing it out in a bright, featureless white glare. But at the edges of the glare, where the exposure was better, I could make out what appeared to be the surface of something. It was not bark, it was not fabric, it had a texture that looked like skin, tight, wrinkled skin pulled over sharp angles, the way skin looks over a very prominent bone. I could see what might have been the ridge of a cheekbone or an orbital socket, but the exposure was too bright and too close for me to be sure. There was a dark spot that could have been an eye, or a shadow, or a hole. The thing, whatever it was, did not move for the entire 30 seconds of the clip. It was just there, close, facing the camera, still. The clip ended. There were no more recordings after that. I watched those 2 clips over and over that Monday night. I watched clip 9 frame by frame, trying to make out more detail on the shape that crossed the edge of the frame. I watched clip 12 and tried to see a face in the overexposed blur. I couldn't. The images were too poor, too ambiguous, too uncertain. If I showed them to someone, they'd see a blurry shape in the woods and a close-up of something white and featureless. They'd shrug and say it was a deer, or a tree branch, or a camera malfunction. But I know what I saw through those clips, and I know what I saw with my own eyes in the clearing, and I know what I heard through the wall of the cabin that night. And none of it lines up with anything that should be in those woods. About 2 weeks later, I was at a bar in Bemidji with a guy I know from work, a guy named Dale who grew up on the Leech Lake Reservation south of there. Dale's Ojibwe, and he's one of those guys who's quiet most of the time, but when he talks, it's worth listening. We were having beers and I was debating whether to tell him about what happened. I decided to test the water without committing to the full story. I said something like, "You ever hear stories about anything weird in the Chippewa Forest? Animals that aren't supposed to be there, or tracks that don't make sense?" Dale looked at me for a long time. He took a drink of his beer and set it down carefully. Then he said, "Why are you asking?" I told him about the tracks. Just the tracks, not the breathing, not the radio, not the thing in the trees. Just the tracks that didn't match any animal I knew, the tracks that led up to trees and stopped, the fact that whatever made them didn't leave normal signs of passage. Dale was quiet for a while. Then he said, and I'm paraphrasing because I don't remember his exact words, something along the lines of, "My grandmother used to tell us that some things in the woods are old, older than the trees. She said there are things that got hungry a long time ago and never stopped being hungry, and they walk different from us because they're not like us. She said you don't talk about them by name because talking about them is like leaving a door open." I asked him what she called them. He shook his head. "I'm not going to say it. And you shouldn't try to find out. If something like that was near your cabin, the best thing you can do is not go back and not think about it too much." I pressed him a little. I asked if it was something from Ojibwe stories, something traditional. He finished his beer and said, "It's not a story. Stories are things that happen to other people. What my grandmother was talking about is something that's real and doesn't care about stories." That was all he would say about it. We talked about work for a while after that, and then I drove home. I did my own research later, on the internet, which I know is a minefield of misinformation and creepypasta nonsense. But I read enough from enough different sources, academic papers on Algonquian folklore, ethnographic accounts, interviews with elders, to get a general picture of what Dale's grandmother might have been talking about. There's a concept in several northern native traditions of a being that was once human but became something else through an act of taboo, something that's driven by an insatiable hunger and that lives in the deep woods in winter. The descriptions vary by source, but several of them mention extreme height, emaciation, a connection to starvation and cold, and the ability to move through the woods in ways that don't follow normal physical rules. Several sources specifically mention that these beings don't leave tracks the way a person or animal does, or that their tracks are wrong, distorted, not matching their apparent size or weight. I'm not going to name it. Dale told me not to, and even though I'm not Ojibwe and I don't come from that tradition, I respect it. And honestly, I'm not sure naming it would help anything. What I encountered in those woods doesn't need a name to be real. It was there, it left marks. It turned my camera, it breathed outside my wall, and it stood at the edge of the clearing and watched me leave. I haven't been back to the cabin. That was January 2020. It's been almost 6 years. I still have the tags, the deed to the land, the keys to the cabin. I haven't sold anything, I just don't go. Some of the guys at work have asked me why I stopped going up north, and I tell them I got tired of the drive, or I've been busy, or my knees are getting bad. They accept it because nobody questions why a man in his 30s stops wanting to sit in a tree stand in January. I still have the trail camera footage on my laptop. I've never shown it to anyone. I've never posted it online. I thought about it once or twice, especially when I see those YouTube channels where people share their encounter stories. But the footage is ambiguous enough that it wouldn't prove anything, and clear enough that showing it would mean I'd have to explain everything else, and I don't want to be a guy with a story. But I'll tell you one more thing, and then I'm done. About 3 months after the incident, in April, when the snow had melted and the ground was thawing, I got a call from a conservation officer with the Minnesota DNR. He was doing spring surveys in the Chippewa Forest and had been in the area near my cabin. He wanted to let me know that he'd found a deer carcass about a quarter-mile south of my property. He said it was unusual and asked if I'd noticed anything strange during hunting season. I asked what was unusual about it. He said the deer had been killed and partially consumed, but not in a way consistent with any predator he was familiar with. The bones had been cracked open lengthwise and the marrow removed. The skull had been split, and the carcass had been placed, his word, placed, in the fork of a tree, about 7 feet off the ground. He asked if I'd seen any bear activity in the area. I said no. He said he hadn't either, and that a bear wouldn't crack bones lengthwise like that or put a carcass in a tree. He seemed puzzled but not alarmed. He said he'd file a report and might send a wildlife biologist out in the summer. I don't know if the biologist ever came. I don't know what the report said. I didn't follow up. But I think about that deer. I think about its bones cracked lengthwise for the marrow, the way you'd crack a bone if you were starving and needed every calorie you could get. I think about it placed in a tree, 7 feet up, by something strong enough to lift a deer and deliberate enough to set it in a fork rather than just dropping it. And I think about the word Dale's grandmother used, hungry. Something that got hungry a long time ago and never stopped. I still hunt, just not up there. I hunt state land closer to Bemidji now, places where I can see houses from my stand and hear traffic on the highway. It's not the same. The deer are pressured and skittish, and the woods feel tame and ordinary, which used to bother me and now feels like a gift. Some nights, when I'm lying in bed in my house in town and the wind is blowing and the windows are dark, I think I can hear that breathing again. That deep, slow, wet breathing from outside the cabin wall. I know I can't. I know it's my memory playing tricks, the way a bad dream can echo for years after you wake up. But I also know that in those moments, in the dark, with the wind, it sounds real. It sounds close. I don't check. I just lie still and wait for it to stop. The radio is in a box in my garage. Both handsets, batteries removed. I thought about throwing them away, but I haven't. They were my dad's. I can't bring myself to get rid of them, but I also won't turn one on. Not ever again. And the trail camera footage, the SD card, it's in the drawer of my nightstand. I backed it up to a thumb drive too, which is in the same drawer. Sometimes when I can't sleep, I think about watching those clips again, frame by frame, looking for details I might have missed. Looking for a face in that overexposed blur. trying to understand what I saw. I haven't done it yet. I'm not sure I want to. I'm not sure it would help. Some things aren't meant to be seen that clearly. I know how this sounds. I know it sounds like a story, like something someone made up for the internet. All I can tell you is that everything I've said here is what happened to me in January of 2020 in the woods north of Black Duck, Minnesota. I don't have an explanation. I don't have proof that would convince a skeptic. I have 2 blurry trail camera clips, a broken night of sleep, and a 6-year-old memory of something tall and pale standing in the tree line of my family's property, watching me with an attention that I still feel on the back of my neck when I close my eyes. I don't go north of County 39 anymore. I don't drive the Forest Service roads. I don't even like buying gas in Black Duck, which means I'm going 10 miles out of my way every time I drive that direction. It's irrational, I know. Whatever was up there, if it was anything at all, is 3 miles into the woods at the end of a road nobody uses. It's not coming to Bemidji. It's not following me home. At least I don't think it is. But some nights, in April and May, when the last snow melts and the ground turns soft and the woods wake up from winter, I look out my back window at the tree line behind my property, a thin strip of birch and poplar, maybe 50 yards deep, between my yard and the neighbor's field, and sometimes, just for a second, between the trunks, I think I see something standing there, tall, thin, still, watching. By the time I blink, it's gone, just trees, just wind, just my mind doing what minds do when they've seen something they can't explain and can't forget. I tell myself that. Most of the time I believe it. I need to start with some background so that the rest of this makes sense. My name is Garrett. I am 41 years old now. At the time of what happened, I was 36. I work as an HVAC technician in Prescott, Arizona. I have lived in the Prescott area most of my adult life, minus a few years in Tucson when I was in my early 20s and thought I wanted to go to school for something. That did not work out, but the HVAC apprenticeship did, and I have been doing it ever since. It is honest work. Good money in the summer when everybody is running their units into the ground. Slower in winter, which is when I usually take time off. I grew up around guns and hunting. My father was not a hunter himself, but my Uncle Brian was, and he was the one who got me into it. Uncle Brian had been hunting mule deer and elk in northern Arizona since before I was born. He knew the Kaibab Plateau, the Coconino, the high country around Williams and Parks and Garland Prairie. He had spots up there that he had been using for 20-25 years. Little clearings off unnamed Forest Service roads where he would set up camp every October and stay for a week or more during rifle season. He was the kind of hunter who took it seriously, not trophy hunting, just the process, the scouting, the stillness, the early mornings, the patience. He taught me most of what I know. By the time I was 16, I had been on half a dozen hunting trips with him. By the time I was 25, I had my own gear, my own rifle, my own routines. I still went with Brian sometimes, but I also started going out on my own. I liked the solitude. I am not the kind of person who needs to talk all the time, and there is something about being alone in the woods for a few days that puts my head right. I know that sounds like something people say to sound tough. I do not mean it that way. I just mean that after a long summer of crawling around in attics and dealing with angry homeowners, sitting in a camp chair next to a fire with nobody else around is exactly what I need. The spot I am going to tell you about is one that Brian showed me years ago. I will not give the exact location, and I hope people understand why. It is in northern Arizona, up past Flagstaff, in the general area of the Coconino National Forest, though you could make an argument that it is closer to the edge of the Kaibab depending on which map you are looking at. The relevant point is that it is remote. You take the interstate north out of Flagstaff, and then you get off and take a state highway for a while, and then you turn onto a Forest Service road, and then you turn onto a smaller road that is not marked, and then you follow that for about 11 miles through ponderosa pine and juniper, until you get to a clearing next to a dry wash. The wash runs roughly north to south and is maybe 50-60 feet across at its widest point. Most of the year it is bone dry, just sand and rock and some dead brush. During monsoon season or snowmelt it might carry some water, but in late October it is nothing, just a wide channel cut into the ground with sandy banks maybe 4 or 5 feet deep on each side. The clearing where I camp is on the east side of the wash, set back about 150 yards from the edge. There is a flat area there between the ponderosa pines where you can park a truck and set up a tent and have a fire without worrying about burning anything down. The trees are tall and spaced out the way they get at that elevation. Not thick forest, not open grassland, something in between. You can see maybe 80 or 100 yards through the trees in most directions during the day. At night, with a fire going, your visibility drops to maybe 30 or 40 feet depending on the flames. The elevation is somewhere around 7,000 feet. In late October, the days can be cool and pleasant, high 40s, low 50s during the day. At night it drops. I have seen it get into the low 20s up there. Sometimes there is frost, sometimes there is not. The air is dry and thin and smells like pine sap and dust. If you have spent any time in the high desert forests of Arizona, you know that smell. It is unlike anywhere else. I had been going to this particular spot every fall for about 5 years before the trip I am going to describe. Each time, I would go up for 4 or 5 days. Sometimes Brian came with me. A few times I brought a friend from work named Dale. Most of the time I went alone. I had trail cameras set up in a few spots around the area. I knew where the deer moved. I knew the game trails. I knew the water sources, which in that area were mostly a few small stock tanks and one spring about 2 miles north of camp that trickled out of a hillside into a little pool. Deer, elk, and everything else in the area used it. On every previous trip it had been fine, quiet, normal. I never had any issues. The most exciting thing that ever happened was a black bear wandering through camp one morning while I was away. I found its tracks and some torn-up trash when I got back, and I cussed myself for not securing my cooler better, and that was it. Other than that, it was the same every year. Get up before dawn, hike out to a spot, sit in glass, hunt, come back, eat, sit by the fire, sleep, repeat. That is what hunting is most of the time. It is just being outside and waiting. I am telling you all of this so that you understand that I was not some amateur going into unfamiliar territory. I knew this area. I was comfortable there. I had spent dozens of nights alone in these woods without any trouble. What happened in October of 2019 was not something I was expecting, and it was not something I had any frame of reference for. I took the last week of October off from work. Rifle season for mule deer had opened a few days earlier, and I had already seen good sign on my trail cameras during my September scouting trip. A decent 4-point buck had been coming through a saddle about 1.5 miles north of camp almost every evening. I was optimistic. I had asked Dale if he wanted to come, but he had a thing with his daughter that weekend and could not make it. Brian was dealing with a knee replacement recovery and was not doing any hunting that year, so it was just me, which was fine. I spent the evening before the trip getting my gear together in the garage. I have a system for this. I pack the truck the same way every time. The big stuff goes in the bed. The tent, the cot, the cooler, the water jugs, the firewood. I always bring a few bundles of firewood from home because finding good dry wood up there in October is not always easy. The smaller stuff goes in the cab or in a plastic tote behind the driver's seat. My rifle in its case, ammunition, my hunting vest, binoculars, rangefinder, headlamp, a couple of flashlights, my GPS unit, fire starting kit, first aid kit, food, coffee, a camp stove, and a few other things. One of those other things was a handheld radio, a Baofeng UV5R. It is a cheap little two-way radio, the kind you can pick up for $25 or $30. I had bought a pair of them a couple of years earlier for when Brian and I hunted together, so we could stay in contact without relying on cell phones. Cell service in that area is non-existent. You cannot get a signal even on the best carrier. I am talking about 0 bars, no data, nothing. The Baofeng was our backup. I would carry one, Brian would carry the other, and we would check in with each other a few times a day on a preset channel. Simple. Since Brian was not coming, I almost did not bring the radio. But at the last minute I tossed it into the tote along with a spare battery. I told myself it was just in case. In case of what, I did not really know. I just figured having a radio was better than not having one when you were alone and miles from the nearest road with no phone service. I left Prescott at about 4 a.m. on a Thursday. It is roughly a 2.5-hour drive to the turnoff, maybe a little more depending on how you time the Flagstaff traffic, though at 4 a.m. there is no traffic. I stopped at a gas station on the north side of Flagstaff to fill up and grab a large coffee. The kid behind the counter looked half asleep. There was a hunting license check station sign taped to the window, reminding hunters to report their kills. I paid for the gas and got back on the road. North of Flagstaff, the landscape opens up. The ponderosa pines thin out a little, and you start seeing more grassland between the tree lines. The road climbs and drops through shallow valleys, and in the headlights you can see the grass on the shoulders swaying in the wind. A jackrabbit darted across the road at one point, its eyes flashing green in the beams for half a second before it was gone. The sky was still black when I got off the state highway and turned onto the Forest Service road. That first road is maintained, graded gravel, wide enough for 2 vehicles. The speed limit is technically 25, but most people do 40. There is a cattle guard at the turnoff, and the clang of it under the tires always feels like a boundary. You cross that cattle guard and you are leaving the normal world behind. No more center lines, no more guardrails, just gravel and trees. After about 6 miles, I turned onto the unmarked road. This one is rougher, single lane, ruts and rocks and washboard. My truck is a 2012 Ford F-150 with 4-wheel drive and decent clearance, so it handles it fine, but you still have to take it slow. The road dips through a couple of dry creek crossings where the gravel gives way to hard-packed clay, and there are places where the ponderosas close in tight enough that the branches scrape the side mirrors. I crept along at about 15 miles an hour, my headlights cutting a narrow tunnel through the trees, the coffee going cold in the cup holder. There is no cell service past the cattle guard. I watched the bars on my phone drop to 0 about 2 miles in, and after that the phone was just a clock and a camera. You are on your own out here. That is part of what I like about it, and it is part of what makes this story hard to tell, because out here, when something happens, there is nobody to call. The 11 miles on that road took me about 45 minutes. I saw a pair of elk cross the road about a mile from camp. 2 cows moving slowly through the headlight beams, their coats dull brown and their breath steaming in the cold air. They did not spook. They just walked across and disappeared into the trees on the south side. A good sign. If the elk were calm and moving normally, the area was quiet. I pulled into the clearing just as the sky was starting to lighten in the east. Not sunrise yet, just that first thin band of gray above the tree line, turning the bottoms of the clouds from black to charcoal. I shut off the engine and sat there for a minute with the window cracked, listening. That is something I always do when I arrive. I just sit and listen to the place. Let my ears adjust from the sound of the truck engine and the road to the quiet of the forest. It is a kind of ritual, I guess, my way of saying hello to the place. And it was quiet, not silent. You could hear a breeze moving through the treetops, a constant soft rushing sound that rises and falls like breathing. A few birds starting up somewhere off to the north, a squirrel chattering in a tree close by, the occasional tick of the cooling engine. But quiet the way the woods are quiet. No human noise, no motors, no roads, no voices, just the land doing what it does. I got out, stretched, and started setting up camp. I have done this enough times that I can get the tent up and the camp organized in about 45 minutes. I use a 4-person dome tent even though it is just me, because I like the space for my gear. I set up the cot inside, rolled out my sleeping bag, arranged my stuff. I set the cooler in the shade on the north side of the tent. I made a fire ring out of some rocks I had arranged on previous trips. They were still there from last year, exactly where I had left them. By the time I had camp set up and a small fire going for coffee, the sun was coming through the trees. It was a beautiful morning. Mid-40s, clear sky, no wind. The ponderosas were catching the light and turning orange and gold. There were a few scrub oaks in the area that had started changing color, and their leaves were this deep rusty red that looked almost unreal against the green of the pines. I spent the first morning just getting settled and doing a short walk around the area to check my trail cameras. I had 3 of them set up. One near the stock tank about half a mile east, one on the game trail that ran along the west side of the wash, and one up in the saddle where I had been seeing the buck. The stock tank camera and the game trail camera both had plenty of pictures: deer, elk, a few coyotes, a jackrabbit, normal stuff. The saddle camera had a few pictures of the buck. He was still in the area. I felt good about that. I ate lunch back at camp, a sandwich and some jerky. Then I grabbed my rifle and my binoculars and hiked out to a spot I like on a low ridge about a mile north of camp where I can see the saddle and a couple of game trails below me. I sat there for 3 hours, glassing. I saw a few does and a small buck, but not the one I was after. That was fine. It was the first afternoon. I was not in any rush. I walked back to camp as the sun was going down. The temperature dropped fast. By the time I had a fire going and was heating up some canned chili on the camp stove, it was probably in the low 30s. I put on my heavier jacket and sat close to the fire. That first night was completely uneventful. I sat by the fire until about 9, watching the flames work through the split pine I had brought from home. The fire popped and sent sparks spiraling up into the black sky, and I watched them rise and wink out against the stars. I could see Orion above the tree line to the southeast, clear and sharp. The coyotes started up way off to the west, maybe a mile or more, and I listened to them for a while. There is something about coyotes at a distance that makes the world feel large and old and unconcerned with you. They are out there doing their thing, and you are here doing yours, and the land holds both without caring. I finished my coffee and rinsed the cup and let the fire burn down to coals. Then I crawled into the tent and zipped it up and got into the sleeping bag. The cot is not comfortable exactly, but it keeps you off the ground, and the sleeping bag is rated to 15 degrees, so I was warm enough. I lay there listening to the sounds of the night settling in around me. The wind picked up around midnight and shook the tent walls, and a branch somewhere nearby creaked in a slow rhythm, back and forth. An owl called once, twice, 3 times, each call spaced about 10 seconds apart, and then it went quiet. Normal night in the woods. I fell asleep without trouble and slept straight through until morning. I woke up Friday morning before dawn, 5:15 according to my watch. I lay there for a minute listening. No wind, no coyotes, just the absolute stillness that you get at that elevation right before the sun comes up. I got out of the sleeping bag, pulled on my boots and jacket, and went outside to get the fire started. It was cold. I could see my breath in the beam of my headlamp. The stars were still out, thick and bright the way they get when there is no light pollution for 50 miles in any direction. I got the fire going and put the coffee on and sat there in the near total stillness, waiting for enough light to move. I was in my spot on the ridge by 6:30. The sun came up and the forest turned gold again. I glassed the saddle and the trails below. At about 7:45, I saw the buck. He was moving along the tree line on the far side of the saddle, maybe 300 yards out. Too far for a clean shot with my setup. I am not a long-range shooter. I use a Remington 700 in Type 30-06, and I am comfortable out to about 200 yards. Beyond that, I do not take the shot. Brian taught me that. You do not take a shot you are not confident in. So I watched the buck move through the trees and disappear over the ridge, and I noted the direction and the time, and I figured I would try to set up closer the next morning. I stayed on the ridge until about noon, then hiked back to camp. That is when I noticed the first thing that was a little off. When I got back, my camp looked exactly the way I had left it. Fire ring, tent, cooler, truck, nothing disturbed, but there was a smell. Not a strong smell, and not immediately identifiable. It was a musky, organic smell, like something between a wet dog and a dead animal, but not exactly either of those things. It was faint, just enough to notice. I walked around the camp looking for the source. I checked under the truck. I checked around the tent. I checked the cooler. Nothing. I walked a wide circle around the perimeter of the clearing, maybe 30 yards out, and I did not find anything. No dead animal, no scat, no obvious source. I figured it was probably a deer or an elk that had passed through while I was away. Maybe one had bedded down near camp for a while. Deer have a smell to them, and so do elk, especially the bulls during the rut, which would have been winding down by late October, but was not entirely over. It was not exactly right for either of those, but I did not have a better explanation, and I did not spend much time thinking about it. Smells in the woods come and go, things decompose, scat dries and intensifies, and then fades. You learn not to worry about every scent your nose picks up, or you will drive yourself crazy. I ate some lunch, rested for a while in the camp chair with my hat pulled down, and then went out again in the afternoon to scout a closer approach to the saddle for the next morning. I took a different route this time, circling around to the west and coming up on the saddle from the downhill side. The terrain was rougher over there, with more deadfall and loose volcanic rock on the slope, but it put me closer to where I had seen the buck. I found the cluster of fallen ponderosas I was thinking of, 3 or 4 big trunks piled up where a windstorm had knocked them over probably a decade ago. They had grayed and dried and settled into the ground, and there was enough space between them to set up a shooting position with a clear line of sight to the game trail about 150 yards above. I marked the spot on my GPS and walked back to camp the long way, following the edge of the wash for about half a mile. The wash was dry and quiet, the sand at the bottom undisturbed, the banks lined with rabbit brush that had gone yellow and dried out for the season. I did not think anything about it at the time. It was just a dry wash. There was nothing in it that caught my attention. That evening, Friday evening, I was sitting by the fire as the sun went down. The temperature was dropping again, maybe a little faster than the night before. There was a high, thin overcast moving in from the west, the kind that makes the sunset look washed out and pale instead of vivid. I had the fire built up good because I planned to sit out for a while. At about 6:30, maybe 6:45, I heard the coyotes start up again. They were off to the west, same general direction as the night before, but maybe a little closer. 3 or 4 of them by the sound of it, yipping and howling the way they do. If you have not heard coyotes in person, it can sound like a lot more of them than there actually are. 3 coyotes can sound like 10. It is just the way their voices layer on top of each other. I sat there listening to them. I like hearing coyotes. It is one of the sounds of the West, like wind through pines or a red-tailed hawk screaming. It means the world is working the way it should. But then, after about 10 minutes, they stopped, all at once. Not a gradual trailing off, but a hard stop, like someone had flipped a switch. Now coyotes do stop. They do not howl all night. They go through bursts of vocalization and then go quiet. That is normal. But this felt different, and I will tell you why. When coyotes just finish a bout of howling, there is usually a last yip or two, a little trailing note, and then the night sounds fill back in. The insects, the breeze, the rustle of things moving in the brush. But when these coyotes stopped, everything stopped. The whole forest went quiet. Not just the coyotes, everything. I sat there by the fire and listened, and I could not hear a single thing beyond the crackle of the flames. No insects, no wind, no owls, nothing. Just the fire and the silence. It lasted maybe 2 minutes, maybe 3. I do not know for certain because I was not timing it, but it was long enough that I noticed it. Long enough that I stopped chewing the piece of jerky in my hand and just sat there with my head tilted, trying to pick up any sound at all. Then the wind came back. A little gust moved through the treetops, and with it came the normal sounds. A branch creaking somewhere, something small rustling in the brush off to the south, an owl starting up in the distance. The forest came back to life as if nothing had happened. I relaxed a little. I told myself it was one of those things. Sometimes the woods just go quiet. Maybe a predator moved through the area and everything clamped down. A mountain lion, maybe. There were lions in that area. I had never seen one, but I had found tracks on a previous trip, big round cat prints in the mud near the stock tank, and Brian said he had seen one once at a distance, years ago, a long tawny shape moving through the trees like smoke. A lion moving through would shut everything up. That is documented. That is real. Every prey animal in the area would go silent and still until the threat passed. That made sense to me, and I let it go. I put another log on the fire and watched the flames take it, the bark curling and blackening and the sap hissing out the ends. The temperature was dropping steadily. I could feel the cold on the back of my neck and on my ears, even though the fire was warm on my face and hands. The contrast between the two, the heat in front and the cold behind, is something you get used to when you spend time by campfires in the mountains. It is a reminder that the warmth only extends so far, and beyond it is the night. I went to bed around 9:30. I fell asleep without much trouble, though it took a little longer than the previous night. But I woke up at some point in the middle of the night, and I am not sure what woke me. I lay there in the sleeping bag on the cot, staring up at the roof of the tent, and I listened. The wind was moving through the trees, steady and low. Nothing unusual, but I had this feeling. It is hard to describe. It was not fear exactly. It was more like the feeling you get when you are sitting in a room and you become aware that someone is standing behind you. That prickling awareness on the back of your neck. Except I was lying down in a tent in the middle of the woods, and there was no one else for miles. I lay there for maybe 10 minutes, waiting for the feeling to pass or for something to happen that would explain it. Nothing did. Eventually I rolled over and went back to sleep. Saturday morning, day 3. I was up at 5, same as before. I went through the routine. Fire, coffee, gear. I wanted to get out early because I had a plan to set up about 150 yards closer to the saddle than where I had been sitting. There was a cluster of fallen ponderosas on the slope below the ridge that would give me good cover and put me well within range if the buck came through on the same path. I hiked out in the pre-dawn gray. It was colder than the previous mornings. My thermometer read 27 degrees when I left camp. There was frost on the ground, and the grass crunched under my boots. Everything was still. That deep, profound stillness that comes right before dawn in the high country. I could hear my own breathing, my own heartbeat, the soft crunch of each step. I got to my new spot and settled in behind the fallen trees. I had a good sight line to the game trail where I had seen the buck the day before. I set up my rifle on a rest, got my binoculars out, and waited. The sun came up, and the frost started to melt, and the trees began to creak and pop the way they do when the temperature shifts. I heard a woodpecker somewhere behind me, hammering away at a dead tree. A pair of stellar jays chased each other through the branches overhead. At about 7:20, a doe came through the saddle, then another, then a young spikebuck following behind them. They moved slowly, browsing, not spooked. I watched them through my binoculars and did not move. If the does were coming through here, the bigger buck might not be far behind. But he did not show. I sat there until 10, and he did not come. I was a little disappointed but not surprised. Deer do not follow the same pattern every single day. He might have moved to a different part of his range. He might have come through earlier before I got there. He might have winded me. There were plenty of explanations. I got up, stretched, and started to head back toward camp. That is when I noticed the tracks. I was walking along the edge of the dry wash, about a quarter-mile north of camp, when I saw them in the sand at the bottom of the wash. Footprints, and they stopped me dead. They were not deer tracks. They were not elk tracks. They were not coyote or lion or bear tracks. They looked like barefoot human prints, pressed into the sand at the bottom of the wash, one after another, walking north to south. I stood there on the bank and stared at them. The wash was about 5 feet deep at that point, with sandy banks that sloped down to a flat sandy bottom. The prints were clear: toes, ball of the foot, heel, barefoot, and they were big. Not freakishly big, but bigger than my boot print would be. I wear a size 11. These looked like maybe a 13 or 14. The stride length was long, too, longer than mine would be if I were walking at a normal pace. I climbed down into the wash to get a closer look. The prints went on for maybe 60 or 70 yards that I could see, heading south along the wash bottom. They did not waver or meander. They went in a straight line, evenly spaced, as if whoever made them was walking with purpose. Here is the thing that bothered me. It was late October. The overnight temperature had been in the 20s. The sand in the bottom of that wash was cold enough to burn your feet. You would not walk through there barefoot unless something was wrong with you. And the nearest road, even the unnamed Forest Service road I came in on, was miles away. The nearest town, the nearest house, the nearest anything, was a long, long way off. I stood in the wash and looked north, then south, following the line of the prints. The wash curved and I could not see more than about 100 yards in either direction. The banks were lined with brush and juniper on both sides. I could not see anyone. My first thought was that it was another hunter, maybe someone from a nearby camp who had lost his boots somehow, or some kind of eccentric who liked walking barefoot. That did not make much sense, but it was the first thing that came to mind. People do strange things. I once met a guy at a trailhead who was hiking in sandals in November. People are weird. My second thought was that it might be someone in trouble, someone who had gotten lost, who had lost their gear, who was hypothermic or disoriented. That thought concerned me more, because if someone was out here barefoot and in trouble, they were in real danger. Hypothermia kills people in this kind of country every year. I thought about following the tracks, but I hesitated. I looked at them again. They were fresh. The edges were crisp and clean. The sand compressed neatly at the bottom of each print with no crumbling or softening from wind. They had been made recently, maybe within the last few hours. Maybe while I was sitting on the ridge with my binoculars, glassing for a deer, someone had walked through this wash right behind my camp. There was something else about the prints that I noticed but did not fully process at the time. It was not until later, when I was sitting by the fire going over everything in my head, that it crystallized. The prints were deep, pressed into the sand with a weight that seemed heavier than a normal person walking. I wear a size 11 boot, and I weigh about 190, and when I walk in sand I leave a print maybe half an inch deep at most. These prints were deeper, 3/4 of an inch, maybe a full inch, and the edges were sharp, almost as if the foot had been pressed straight down and lifted straight up, rather than rolling forward the way a human foot naturally does when you walk. I climbed back out of the wash and walked back to camp. I found myself looking over my shoulder more than once on the walk back, scanning the tree line and the wash behind me. I was not scared yet. Not exactly. But the word that comes to mind is uneasy. Something was tugging at my attention, the way a splinter under your skin tugs at you. You can ignore it, but you know it is there. I kept looking around me as I walked, more aware of my surroundings than I had been on any of the previous days. I was not scared at that point. I was just unsettled. Something about those prints did not sit right. The size, the stride, the barefoot and freezing temperatures. It did not add up, but it did not add up in a way that was more puzzling than frightening. When I got back to camp, I checked everything. Nothing had been touched. The tent was fine. The cooler was fine. The truck was fine. But I noticed the smell again, that same faint musky odor I had detected the day before. It was subtle, right at the edge of perception, and it seemed to be coming from the direction of the wash. I got the Baofeng radio out of the tote in the truck. I had not used it yet on this trip. I turned it on and set it to the channel Brian and I usually used, channel 7. I keyed the mic and said, "This is Garrett, anybody on this frequency?" I let go of the transmit button and listened. Static. Nothing but a low hiss. I tried again. "This is Garrett. If anyone can hear me, come back." Nothing. I was not really expecting a response. There was no one to respond. Brian was home in Prescott with his knee. Dale was with his daughter. Nobody else I knew used that channel. But I felt better having the radio on me. I clipped it to my belt and left it powered on. I spent the rest of the afternoon in camp. I cleaned my rifle. I reorganized some of my gear. I walked the perimeter of the clearing a couple of times, looking at the ground, looking into the trees. I did not see anything unusual. No more tracks. No sign of anyone. At about 4:30, I hiked out to check the trail camera on the game trail along the west side of the wash. This camera was mounted on a ponderosa pine about 5 feet off the ground, aimed at a heavily used trail that deer followed along the edge of the wash. I had checked it on Thursday, and it was fine. Full battery, aimed correctly, working. When I got to the tree, the camera was still there, but it had been turned, not fallen, not knocked off by an animal bumping the tree. The strap was still tight around the trunk. The camera had been physically rotated on the strap so that it was now pointing almost straight up into the canopy instead of at the trail. Something or someone had grabbed it and twisted it. I stood there looking at it for a long time. A bear could do that. A bear could reach up and swat at it or bite at it. But a bear would have left marks, claw marks on the bark, teeth marks on the camera housing. There was nothing. The camera was undamaged. It had simply been turned. Deliberately, it seemed to me. I rotated it back into position and checked the SD card. I popped it out and put it in the little card reader I carry, connected to my phone, and scrolled through the images. The last pictures it had taken before being turned were from the previous day. A few deer coming down the game trail at dusk, their eyes glowing in the infrared flash. A coyote trotting through at about 10 in the evening, pausing to look directly at the camera with that sharp, knowing expression coyotes have. Then a gap of a few hours, and then one photo that made me stop scrolling. It was a blur, something very close to the lens, too close to focus. The motion blur was extreme, as if something had moved past the camera at high speed right in front of it, or something had reached for the camera and triggered the motion sensor as it did. The color was indeterminate, brown or gray. The shape was meaningless, just a streak of unfocused color. The timestamp said 2:17 a.m. After that photo, the camera had been pointing at the sky, and the remaining images were nothing but branches and the faint glow of the overcast. I stared at that blurred image for a long time. I zoomed in. I tried to make something out of it. There was nothing to see, just a blur. But someone or something had been right there, inches from that camera, at 2 in the morning, and then had turned the camera to face the sky. I put the SD card back in and left the camera. I walked back to camp with a feeling in my gut that I do not think I can explain well. It was not panic, it was not dread, it was the feeling of a puzzle that does not have enough pieces to solve. Barefoot tracks in a freezing wash. A camera turned to face the sky. A smell with no source. Each thing by itself could be explained. Together they made a picture that I could not quite see. Saturday evening was when things started to change in a way that I cannot explain away. I built the fire up bigger than usual. I am not sure why. I told myself it was because it was going to be a cold night, and that was true. The overcast had thickened through the afternoon, and the temperature was already in the mid-30s by 5 o'clock. But I think, if I am being honest, I built the fire up because I wanted more light around me. I wanted to be able to see farther into the trees. I cooked dinner, rice and canned stew heated on the camp stove. I ate sitting in my camp chair, watching the fire and the tree line beyond it. The shadows shifted and moved with the flames. The nearest trees were lit up in orange and gold, and beyond them was a wall of deep blue gloom that thickened into black where the firelight could not reach. At about 7, I heard something move in the brush to the northwest of camp. Not close, maybe 80 or 100 yards out. A rustling, crunching sound, like something walking through dry leaves and fallen branches. I turned my head and listened. It moved for maybe 10 seconds, then stopped. I was not alarmed. Things move in the woods at night. Deer, elk, porcupines, skunks, raccoons, foxes, all of them make noise when they move through brush. I listened for another minute, heard nothing more, and went back to eating. At about 7:30, I heard it again. Same direction, but closer, maybe 60 yards. The same kind of sound, something moving through brush. Footsteps, not fast, not slow, a steady, measured pace. I set my bowl down and turned fully in that direction. I had my headlamp on my head but turned off, and I reached up and switched it on, pointing the beam toward the sound. The beam cut maybe 40 yards into the trees before it faded into the trunks and branches. I could not see anything. The sound had stopped the moment I turned the light on. I sat there with the headlamp on, sweeping it slowly back and forth across the tree line. Nothing, just ponderosa trunks and the gaps between them and the black beyond. I turned the headlamp off and sat there. My rifle was in the tent, leaned against the cot. I thought about getting it, but I did not feel like I was in immediate danger. Whatever was out there was probably a deer or an elk. They come through at night. It happens all the time. Then, at about 7:45, I heard something that made me stop breathing for a second. A voice, a human voice, coming from the direction of the wash. It was faint, distant. I would guess it was coming from somewhere in the wash, maybe 200 yards south of camp, maybe more. The wash curved in that direction, and sound can carry strangely in those channels, bouncing off the banks and amplifying in ways you would not expect. But even accounting for that, it was distant, and it said my name. Garrett. Just that. One word, my name, spoken clearly, in a normal tone of voice, as if someone were calling me from across a yard. Not shouting, not whispering, just saying it, like they expected me to hear it and come over. I sat there frozen. The piece of jerky I had been eating was still between my fingers. I set it down without looking at it. I replayed the sound in my head immediately because my first instinct was that I had imagined it. The wind, a bird, a branch creaking in a way that sounded like a word. Pareidolia. Your mind does that. It fills in patterns where there are no patterns. You hear your name in white noise, in running water, in the rumble of an engine. I have read about that. It is a known thing. The brain wants to find meaning, so it manufactures it from whatever raw sound is available. I sat there for maybe 30 seconds, holding still, barely breathing, straining to hear anything else. The fire crackled. An ember popped and a tiny shower of sparks rose up. The trees stood there in the gloom like pillars holding up nothing. Then it came again. Garrett. Same voice, same tone, same direction, same distance, and this time I did not doubt what I heard. It was not the wind, it was not a bird, it was not my imagination manufacturing a pattern from random noise. It was my name, 2 syllables, spoken clearly, distinctly, by a human voice, a male voice. And here is the part that sent a cold, sick feeling through my stomach. It sounded like Dale. Not exactly like Dale, close enough. The pitch was right. The cadence was right. That slight flat quality that Dale had, the way he kind of swallowed the last syllable of words. It sounded like someone doing a very, very good impression of Dale. Or it sounded like Dale was standing in the wash 200 yards away calling my name in the middle of the night. But Dale was not there. Dale was in Prescott with his daughter. Dale did not know the exact location of this camp. Even if he did, he would not have driven up here unannounced in the middle of the night and walked into a dry wash in the freezing cold to call my name. I sat there, and I did not move. The fire crackled, the wind moved through the treetops, and I waited. A minute went by, maybe 2. Then, Garrett, a third time, same voice, same direction, but maybe, a little closer. Or maybe that was my imagination. It is hard to judge distance by sound alone, especially in terrain like that, with the wash acting as a natural amplifier. I reached down and unclipped the bao feng from my belt. I do not know exactly why I did this. It was instinctive. If someone was out there calling me, maybe they were on a radio, maybe someone had our frequency, maybe Brian had given the channel information to someone. I do not know what I was thinking. I was grasping for explanations. I keyed the mic. Dale, is that you? Come back. I released the button and held the radio up to my ear. Static, low hiss, nothing. Dale, if you can hear me, key your mic. I am at camp. Come back. Nothing. I clipped the radio back to my belt and stood up. I picked up the flashlight from the camp table, a Surefire with a 600 lumen beam. I pointed it toward the wash, toward where the voice had come from. The beam was strong enough to cut through the trees for a good distance, but the wash was beyond its reach. All I could see were the trunks of ponderosas and the brush at the edge of the tree line, fading into black. I stood there for a long time. 5 minutes, 10, I do not know. The voice did not come again. I went to the tent and got my rifle. I checked the chamber, confirmed a round was loaded, and leaned it against my camp chair where I could reach it immediately. I sat back down. I put another log on the fire. I held the flashlight in my left hand, resting it on my thigh, pointed toward the wash. The voice did not come back that night. I sat by the fire until after midnight, awake and listening. The coyotes never started up. The forest was quiet, that deep quiet that I had noticed before. Not silent exactly. There was wind. There were the small sounds of the fire. But the quality of the quiet had changed. It felt compressed, close, like the air itself was holding still. I did not sleep well Saturday night. I lay in the tent with my rifle next to the cot and the flashlight in my hand, and I drifted in and out of a light, restless half-sleep. Every time I started to go under, some small sound would bring me back. A branch snapping, the tent fabric shifting. My own heartbeat. Sunday morning, day 4. I was up at 5, and I felt rough, tired, stiff, cold. The overcast was still there, low and gray, and the light that came with dawn was flat and colorless. The temperature was 24 degrees. I built the fire and made coffee, and sat there trying to think clearly. In the daylight, the voice seemed less real. I started going through rational explanations. Sound carries in strange ways in the woods. Maybe it was not my name at all. Maybe it was a coyote making a sound that my tired brain interpreted as a word. Maybe it was another hunter in the area, calling for their own companion. And the wash distorted the sound into something that resembled my name. These were all possible. None of them felt right, but they were all possible. I decided to walk the wash. In daylight, with my rifle, I was going to follow it south in the direction the voice had come from and see if there was any sign of anyone. I left camp at about 7:30. The sun was up, though you could not see it through the overcast. Everything was lit in that diffuse, flat gray light that makes distances hard to judge and shadows disappear. I walked to the edge of the wash and looked down. More tracks, the same barefoot prints, in the same style, big, long stride. This time they were running roughly north to south along the bottom of the wash, just like before. But these were newer. The edges were sharp. They had not been there when I checked on Friday. These had been made recently. Overnight, possibly. I climbed down into the wash and started walking south, following the tracks. The wash was about 50 feet wide here, with sandy banks on both sides and a mix of sand and gravel on the bottom. The brush along the top of the banks was thick, mostly dead rabbit brush and some scrubby juniper, and it blocked my view of the surrounding forest. I could see the sky above me and the wash ahead of me and behind me, and that was about it. I walked for maybe 10 minutes. The tracks continued in their straight line, no deviation, no stopping, no turning. Whoever or whatever made them had walked through this wash in a straight line without pausing, without looking around, without hesitating, like something that knew exactly where it was going and was not interested in anything along the way. The tracks did not go around obstacles. There was a fallen juniper branch across the wash floor at one point, and the tracks went right over it. The branch was thick enough that you would have to step up onto it and down the other side. The prints showed exactly that, one on the near side, one on top of the branch where the sand had been pressed into the bark, one on the far side. Clean, purposeful, mechanical. The wash was quiet. The banks rose up on either side, blocking my view and muffling the wind. It felt like walking in a trench. I could see the sky above me, gray and overcast, and the walls of sand and rock on either side, and the flat sandy floor ahead. No sounds except my own footsteps and the soft crunch of sand under my boots. Then I found something that made me stop. Off to the left side of the wash, at the base of the bank, there was a small pile of something. I walked over to it, my rifle shifting on its sling as I bent down. It was a pile of hair, animal hair. Coarse, dark brown hair, maybe 3 or 4 inches long, clumped together as if it had been pulled from something. There was a lot of it, enough to fill both of my hands. It was sitting on top of the sand, not buried or scattered, just placed there. I crouched down and looked at it. It did not smell like anything. It was dry. The individual hairs were coarse and stiff, like deer or elk hair, but the color was wrong. It was too uniform, too dark. Deer hair this time of year is a grayish brown. Elk hair is lighter. This was almost black. I did not touch it. I stood up and kept walking. The tracks continued for another 100 yards, and then they stopped. They just ended. The last print was clear and complete, pressed into the sand with the same depth and definition as all the others. And after it, nothing. Clean sand. No scuffing, no skidding, no sign of someone climbing the bank. The tracks just stopped as if the person making them had been lifted off the ground. I stood there and looked at the spot for a long time. Then I looked at the banks on both sides. The left bank was about 5 feet high with some exposed roots and brush at the top. The right bank was a little lower, maybe 4 feet, with more brush. Neither side showed any sign of someone climbing up. No disturbed dirt, no broken branches, no handprints in the sand of the bank. A chill went through me that had nothing to do with the temperature. I am a rational person. I do not believe in the supernatural. I had been telling myself all weekend that there were natural explanations for everything. And standing there in that wash, looking at tracks that simply ended in the middle of clean sand, I could not think of one. I turned around and walked back to camp faster than I had walked out. When I got back, I sat down by the fire and took the radio off my belt and tried again. "This is Garrett. Anyone on Channel 7, come back." Static. I tried Channel 8, Channel 9. I scrolled through every channel I could think of. Nothing but static and silence. I did something then that I am a little embarrassed about now. I called Dale, not on the radio, on my cell phone. I pulled it out of my pocket knowing full well there was no signal, and I looked at the screen, and sure enough, no bars, no service. I held the phone up above my head like an idiot, walked to different spots around the clearing, tried standing on the tailgate of the truck. Nothing, no signal. I wanted to hear Dale's voice, his real voice. I wanted to call him and hear him answer and know that he was in Prescott and not in a dry wash in the middle of the Coconino. But I could not reach him. I spent the rest of Sunday morning in camp, trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave. That was the sensible part, the part that recognized that something was wrong and that being alone in a remote area when something is wrong is not smart. But another part of me, the stubborn part, the part that did not want to feel like I had been chased off by coyote sounds and wind and my own imagination, wanted to stay. I had come here to hunt. I had not filled my tag. The buck was still in the area. Leaving felt like admitting something that I was not ready to admit. I compromised with myself. I decided to stay one more night. Sunday night. I would hunt Monday morning, and if I did not get the buck, I would pack up and leave Monday afternoon. That gave me one more chance at the deer and one more night in camp. If nothing else happened, I would feel foolish for being spooked by sounds in the night and footprints that probably had a perfectly reasonable explanation. If something did happen, well, I had a rifle and a flashlight and a truck with a full tank of gas, and I could be on the highway in less than an hour if I needed to be. That is what I told myself. That is the calculation I made, sitting in my camp chair in the cold gray light of a Sunday morning in late October, with the smell of coffee and smoke and that faint, wrong musk hanging in the still air. I told myself I was being rational. I told myself I was being tough. I told myself that whatever was happening out here had a natural explanation and that I would feel like an idiot if I ran from coyotes and wind and my own nerves. Looking back, I wish I had just left. I wish I had thrown everything in the truck at 9 in the morning and driven out in broad daylight and not looked back. But I did not. I stayed. And what happened that night is something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Sunday afternoon was overcast and cold and still. The clouds had thickened and lowered until they seemed to be sitting on top of the trees. The light was flat and directionless, the kind that makes it hard to judge distance or depth. Everything looked two-dimensional, like a photograph. I went out to the ridge to glass for the buck, but my heart was not in it. I set up in the same spot behind the fallen ponderosas, but instead of watching the game trail, I found myself spending more time looking at the trees around me than looking at the saddle. I kept turning around, checking behind me, scanning the tree line in every direction. The forest looked the same as it always did, ponderosa trunks, gray and orange, standing in their loose spacing. Dry grass, juniper bushes, fallen branches. Nothing moved, nothing made a sound. But the feeling of being watched was persistent and heavy, like a hand pressing on the back of my neck. Not a sudden feeling, not a spike of alarm, but a steady, constant pressure. The certainty that something was aware of me. Something out there in those trees was paying attention to where I was and what I was doing. I know how that sounds. I know that fear makes you feel things that are not real. But I have spent a lot of time in the woods, and I know the difference between the normal alertness you feel in wild country and this. This was something else. This was not coming from inside me. It was coming from outside, from the woods themselves, pressing inward. I sat there for about an hour, and then I could not take it anymore. Not in a panicked way. I just did not want to be out there in the open, alone, with my back to half the forest. I wanted to be in camp, with the truck and the fire and walls of some kind around me, even if those walls were just nylon tent fabric. I went back to camp at about 4. The sun was going down behind the overcast and the light was draining out of the sky. The forest was turning gray. I built the fire early and built it big. I set my camp chair facing south, toward the wash. I put my rifle across my lap. I put the flashlight on the camp table next to me. I clipped the radio to my belt and left it on. I ate dinner. I do not remember what. I think it was the last of the canned stew. I ate without tasting it, my attention on the sounds around me. The fire crackled and popped. The wind was calm. The trees were still. At about 6:15, the coyotes started up again. West side, like before. Same distance, same sound. 4 or 5 of them, yipping and howling in that chaotic chorus. I listened to them for about 5 minutes. Then they stopped. Same as before. Hard stop. All at once. And the silence came back. That deep, unnatural silence that swallowed everything. No insects, no wind, no rustling, just the fire. I sat there with my hands on the rifle, and I waited. At 6:32, I know the time because I checked my watch. I heard it again. Garrett. The wash, south, same distance as the night before, or close to it. Same voice, Dale's voice, or something that sounded so much like Dale's voice that I could not tell the difference. Garrett. Twice, with maybe 10 seconds between them. The same flat, conversational tone. Not calling out the way you would call for someone across a field, raising your voice, projecting. This was the volume you would use to talk to someone in the same room. And yet it carried across 200 yards of open wash and forest, clear and distinct, as if the air between us was not there. As if the distance did not matter. My stomach dropped. My mouth went dry instantly, the way it does when your body dumps adrenaline. I am not going to pretend I was brave about this. I was scared. Not the kind of scared you feel watching a movie or reading a story, where the fear is at a distance and you know it is not real. This was the kind of scared that sits in your chest like a stone and makes your hands grip whatever they are holding until your knuckles ache. The kind that makes you want to be very small and very still and very invisible. The fear of something real that is close to you in the night and that you cannot see and cannot understand. I picked up the radio. I pressed the transmit button. Who is this? Who is on this channel? Identify yourself. I was not calm. I could hear it in my own voice. A little too loud, a little too tight. I released the button. Static. Then for 1 second, maybe less, something came through. Not a voice, not words, a sound, a low breathy sound, like someone exhaling very close to a microphone. Or like an animal panting. It was there, and then it was gone, replaced by the steady hiss of empty static. I held the radio in front of my face and stared at it. My hand was shaking, not a lot, but enough that I could see the radio trembling in my grip. Hello? Respond if you can hear me. Nothing. I clipped the radio back and picked up the flashlight. I aimed it toward the wash. The beam hit the tree trunks and the brush and dissolved into the black beyond. Garrett. Closer. Definitely closer this time. I would say maybe 150 yards instead of 200. Still coming from the wash, still from the south, but closer. As if whatever was calling had been walking toward me while it called. I stood up. The rifle was in my right hand, the flashlight in my left. I turned in a slow circle, sweeping the light around the entire perimeter of the clearing. Trees, brush, the side of the truck, the tent, more trees, nothing, no eyes, no movement, no shape that did not belong. "Garrett, come here." Those last two words, "come here," spoken in the same flat, calm tone, in Dale's voice. And I knew right then with absolute certainty that this was not Dale. This was not a person. This was not something that I could rationalize with wind patterns or acoustics or my imagination. Something in the wash was calling my name in a voice that was not its own, and it was telling me to come to it. I have thought about this moment many times since then. What I felt was not just fear, it was a deep, almost primitive revulsion. The feeling you get when something is fundamentally wrong. When the thing your eyes or ears are telling you is real cannot be real, and your body knows it before your mind catches up. It was the feeling of looking at something that should not exist. I did not go to the wash. I want to be clear about that. I did not go toward the voice. Every part of me that was still thinking clearly told me to stay in the light, stay near the truck, and do not go toward that sound. I backed up until I was standing next to the truck. I reached back and touched the tailgate with my hip. It was solid, cold metal, real. The truck was real. The fire was real. The rifle in my hands was real. I held on to those things. The voice stopped. The silence stretched out. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5. Then I heard something else, not the voice. Footsteps, coming from the north side of camp, through the trees on the opposite side from the wash. Slow, heavy footsteps. 1, 2, 3, each one distinct, each one crunching down on frozen ground and pine needles. I swung the flashlight toward the sound. The beam swept through the trees, lighting up trunk after trunk, casting long shadows that swung across the ground like clock hands. And I saw it, or I saw something. For just a moment, maybe 2 seconds, I caught a figure in the beam, standing motionless between two ponderosa pines about 50 yards from the edge of the clearing. It was tall, taller than it should have been. I am 6 feet even, and I have a good sense of how tall people are. This figure was taller than me by a foot at least, maybe more. It is hard to judge height at that distance in a flashlight beam, but it was tall enough that my first fragmented thought was, that is not a person. The shape was roughly human, 2 legs, 2 arms, an upright posture, but the proportions were wrong. The limbs were too long for the torso. The arms hung down past where they should have, and the legs seemed to have an extra segment of length, as if the thighs were elongated. The torso was too narrow for the height, almost gaunt, and the shoulders were wider than the waist in a way that looked exaggerated, like a triangle standing on its point. It was not standing the way a person stands. It was slightly hunched forward, with its shoulders rounded and its head tilted to one side at an angle that no comfortable posture would produce. It looked like it was studying me, like it was curious about what it was seeing. It was too far away and too far outside the bright center of the flashlight beam for me to make out fine details. I could see the outline. I could see the shape. I could see that its surface was not smooth, that there was something irregular about its texture, rough or matted or covered in something. But the features, the face, the skin or hide or whatever covered it, the hands if they were hands, all of that was lost in shadow and distance and the limitations of a flashlight beam at 50 yards. We looked at each other. I do not know if it had eyes that could look, but I felt it looking. I felt its attention on me the way you feel the sun on your skin, direct and constant and inescapable. That same sensation I had felt in the tent, that prickling awareness, except now it was 100 times stronger because I could see the source. I knew where it was coming from. It was coming from that shape between the pines, and it was looking at me, and it knew that I could see it, and it did not care. Then it moved. It took 1 step to the side, behind the trunk of the ponderosa to its right, and it was gone. Not fast, not a lunge or a sprint, just a single smooth step, like someone stepping behind a wall. One moment it was there, the next it was behind the tree. I held the flashlight on that spot for a long time. The tree was maybe 18 or 20 inches in diameter. Whatever I had seen was taller and wider than the tree trunk. It could not be fully hidden behind it, but I could not see it anymore. Either it had moved away silently, which seemed impossible given the frozen ground and the dry pine needles, or it was standing behind that tree in a way that defied the geometry of what I had just seen. I was breathing hard. My hands were shaking badly now. The rifle was against my shoulder, and I had my finger along the frame above the trigger guard. Brian taught me never to put my finger on the trigger until I was ready to shoot, and even in that moment, with my body flooded with adrenaline and fear, I followed that training. I did not point the rifle at the tree. I did not shoot. I did not know what I was looking at, and I was not going to fire a round into the trees at something I could not see clearly. Then the radio crackled. Not static this time, something different. A burst of noise, like a voice trying to come through but garbled and broken, chopped into fragments that did not form words. It lasted maybe 3 seconds and then cut off. Then it came again, another burst, shorter. And in the middle of it, one syllable that might have been a word. It sounded like it might have been the beginning of my name. Gah, just that. Then static. I pulled the radio off my belt and turned it off. I do not know why. I just could not listen to it anymore. Whatever was coming through that radio was not a transmission from another person. I knew that. I felt it in my bones. The next 10 minutes were the longest of my life. I stood next to the truck with the flashlight in one hand and the rifle in the other, sweeping the beam back and forth across the tree line in every direction. I could not hear anything. The fire was starting to die down, and the ring of light around the camp was shrinking. The shadows between the trees were deepening. I made a decision. I was leaving. Not in the morning, not at dawn, now. I was going to load the truck and drive out of there in the middle of the night on that rough, rocky, single-lane road, 11 miles to the Forest Service Road, and then another 6 miles to the state highway, and then south to Flagstaff and home. I started breaking camp with a speed that surprised me. I kept the rifle slung over my shoulder on its strap, the familiar weight of it against my back, a small comfort. I kept the flashlight in my left hand, sweeping it around me in arcs as I moved. I threw the camp chair into the bed of the truck. The metal legs clanged against the bed liner, and the sound rang out through the trees like a bell. I flinched at my own noise. I grabbed the cooler and heaved it in. I pulled the stakes on the tent, yanking them out of the frozen ground one by one, each one requiring a hard tug that nearly threw me off balance. Then I just collapsed the tent into a heap and dragged the whole thing, cot and sleeping bag and poles all tangled together, to the truck and shoved it into the bed. I did not fold anything. I did not organize. I did not care about the tent poles bending or the sleeping bag getting dirty. I just threw it all in and moved to the next thing. The fire was dying. I kicked dirt over it, not enough to put it out properly, just enough to knock the flames down. I grabbed the camp stove and the food tote and shoved them in the cab. The whole process took maybe 10 or 12 minutes, and during every one of those minutes, I was exposed. Standing in the clearing with my back to one direction or another, my hands full of gear, the flashlight pointing wherever my left hand happened to be aimed. I felt open and vulnerable in a way that I had never felt in the woods before. The whole time I was doing this, I kept looking into the trees, sweeping the flashlight, listening. I heard nothing. I saw nothing. The trees stood in their rows, silent and still, their bark catching the dying firelight in orange patches. But the feeling of being watched had not gone away. If anything, it was stronger, heavier, closer, as if whatever was out there had moved in while I was distracted, tightening the circle. I got in the truck. I locked the doors. I put the key in the ignition and turned it. The engine turned over and caught, and the sound of it was the most comforting thing I had heard in 2 days. I turned on the headlights and the high beams lit up the trees in front of me, and there was nothing there, just pines and brush and the clearing. I put the truck in reverse, backed up to turn around, and pointed it down the road I had come in on. The road was a single track through the trees, with branches brushing the sides of the truck in places. My headlights lit up maybe 60 or 70 feet ahead. Beyond that was the wall of trees and the black. I drove slowly, maybe 10 miles an hour. The road was rough, and I could not afford a flat tire or a broken axle out here. Every bump and rut sent a jolt through the truck that made my teeth clack together. I gripped the steering wheel and stared straight ahead and drove. About 2 miles in, maybe a little less, something crossed the road. I need to slow down here and describe this carefully, because it happened fast and my memory of it is sharp but compressed. The way memories of car accidents or near misses tend to be. Your brain records everything in high definition for a very short period of time, and then it is over, and you are left replaying those 2 seconds for the rest of your life. It came from the left side of the road, from the trees. It moved into the path of my headlights about 40 feet in front of the truck, crossed the road, and disappeared into the trees on the right side. The whole thing took maybe 1.5 seconds. It was on all fours, but not the way an animal is on all fours. A deer runs with a bounding gait, all four legs working in coordinated pairs. A bear has a rolling, shuffling run, heavy and low. A mountain lion is smooth and fluid, a sinuous motion that barely seems to touch the ground. This was none of those. This was more like a person on all fours. The limbs were too long, and the body was too narrow, and the way it moved was wrong in a way that I struggle to articulate. The best I can say is that animals that run on four legs have a certain natural rhythm, a biomechanical efficiency that comes from millions of years of evolution optimizing that gait. This did not have that rhythm. It was more like a scramble. Arms and legs working together, but not in the pattern they should. The elbows bending outward, the knees splaying, like something that was built to stand upright had dropped to all fours and was improvising its way across the ground, like something wearing a shape that did not fit it right. It was across the road and gone before my foot had even moved toward the brake. I hit the brakes instinctively, and the truck skidded a few inches on the gravel. I sat there, engine idling, headlights pointed at the spot where it had crossed, and I could see the trees on the right side of the road and nothing else. I did not stop. I took my foot off the brake and gave it gas. Not fast, not a panic, just steady. Keep moving. Do not stop. The next 9 miles took about 45 minutes. I drove with my jaw clenched and my eyes switching between the road ahead and the side mirrors. The mirrors showed me the road behind, lit in the red glow of my taillights, and the trees closing in on both sides. I did not see anything in the mirrors. Nothing followed me. Nothing ran alongside the truck. Nothing was there. Except once, at maybe the 7-mile mark, I thought I saw something in the right side mirror. A shape, low to the ground, at the very edge of the taillight glow, keeping pace with the truck for a few seconds before falling back into the black. I looked again, and it was gone. I do not know if it was real or if my eyes were playing tricks in the red light and the shadows. I reached the Forest Service road and turned south. The cattle guard clanged under my tires, and the sound of it, the same clang I had heard 4 days earlier going the other direction, felt like crossing a line back into the real world. The road was wider here, graded, smooth enough to do 35 or 40. I sped up, the trees fell back a little on both sides, and I could see more sky above the road. The overcast had broken up in patches, and there were a few stars visible through the gaps, sharp and white. 6 miles to the state highway. I drove them without stopping, without slowing down, without looking in the mirrors anymore. I had the heater on and the radio off, and my hands tight on the wheel at 10 and 2, and I stared at the road ahead, and I drove. When I hit the state highway and felt the tires catch pavement, when the dotted center line appeared in my headlights and the road widened into 2 lanes with actual reflectors and a proper shoulder, I let out a breath that felt like it had been held since sundown. I drove south. The highway was empty. Not a single set of headlights in either direction. Just me and the pavement and the trees rolling by in the headlights and the mile markers counting down. The sky in the east was just barely starting to lighten. Not sunrise yet, but the first pale hint of it, a thin gray line above the tree line that separated the land from the sky. I had left camp at maybe 7 in the evening. It was now, I checked the dashboard clock, 4:47 a.m. That number bothered me. I ran the math in my head. Roughly 2 hours to break camp and drive those 11 miles, plus maybe 30 minutes to reach the highway. That should have put me on the highway by about 9:30, maybe 10 at the latest. Even if it had taken longer than I thought, there was a gap I could not account for. The math did not work. I had lost time somewhere. 30 minutes, maybe 40. I do not know where it went. I do not know what I was doing or where I was during those minutes, and I have never been able to figure it out. It is a blank space in my memory, like a section of tape that has been erased. I stopped at the same gas station on the north side of Flagstaff where I had filled up on Thursday morning. It was open. The fluorescent lights inside were blinding after hours in the black. I went in and bought a coffee and stood at the counter for a minute, just standing under the lights, listening to the hum of the coolers and the distant sound of a semi-rig on the interstate. The kid behind the counter, a different one from Thursday, looked at me and asked if I was okay. I told him I was fine. I do not think I looked fine. My hands were still unsteady. My face probably looked like I had not slept in 2 days, which was close to the truth. But I said I was fine, and I paid for the coffee, and I got back in the truck and drove home to Prescott. I got home at about 7:30 in the morning. I pulled into my driveway and shut off the engine and sat there for a long time. The sun was up, the neighborhood was quiet. A sprinkler was running 2 houses down. A dog was barking somewhere. Normal sounds, normal world. I went inside and took a shower and sat on the couch and stared at the wall. At about 10, I called Dale. He answered on the second ring. He sounded normal, relaxed. He asked me how the hunt went, and I told him I came back early. He asked why. I told him I had a weird experience up there and I would tell him about it later. He did not press. That is one of the things I appreciate about Dale. He knows when not to push. I did tell him about it a few days later. He came over on a Tuesday evening, and we sat in my garage with the door open and drank beer, and I told him the whole thing, from the beginning. The smell, the tracks, the camera, the silence, the voice, the shape in the trees, the thing on the road, the radio, all of it. I told it slowly, and I did not embellish, and I did not leave anything out. He listened without interrupting, which is not like Dale. Dale usually interrupts. He sat in the folding chair with his beer on his knee, and he looked at the floor while I talked, and he did not say a word until I was finished. When I was done, the garage was quiet. I could hear the neighbor's dog and the sound of a television through someone's open window down the street. Then he said, "You said it sounded like me?" I told him it did. I told him it sounded close enough to his voice that if he had called me on the phone and said my name, I would not have been able to tell the difference. He set his beer down. He rubbed the back of his neck with one hand. He was quiet for a long time, and when he finally spoke, his voice was lower than usual. "That is not right," he said. "That is not a normal thing." I told him I knew that. He looked at me then, directly, and I could see that he believed me. He did not think I was making it up or exaggerating or having some kind of breakdown. He could see it in my face, the same way I could feel it in my gut, that what I was describing was real. Something had used his voice, the voice of my friend who was 60 miles away at the time, to call me into a dry wash in the middle of the night. And that reality, the fact of it, the weight of what it meant, settled over both of us like a cold fog. He asked me if I had told Brian. I had not. Dale said maybe I should, and maybe I should not. He said Brian would either think I was losing it, or he would take it seriously, and Dale was not sure which would be worse. Taking it seriously meant admitting that something like this could be real, and that meant admitting that the world had things in it that we did not understand and could not control. He did not say it in those words. He just said, "Once you let that in, you cannot put it back." I did not tell Brian. Not then. Not for a long time. A few weeks later, I was on a job, installing a new unit in a house on the east side of Prescott. The homeowner was a man in his 60s named Frank. We got to talking while I worked, the way you do. He asked about hunting season, and I mentioned that I had been up north but came back early. He asked why, and I gave him a shortened version. Not the whole thing. I left out the voice and the shape. I just told him about the tracks, the barefoot prints in the wash, the camera being turned, the feeling of being watched. Frank got quiet. Then he asked me a question I was not expecting. "Whereabouts were you?" "General area." I told him, northern Coconino, west of the highway, off the Forest Service roads. He nodded slowly. "You know what the Navajo say about that kind of country?" I said I did not. He told me, not everything. He was not Navajo himself. He said he had worked construction on the reservation for a few years in his 30s, and had heard things from the guys on his crew. He did not use the word skinwalker. He called them the ones who walk around at night. He said the Navajo do not like to talk about them. He said that some of the things I described, the voice mimicking someone I knew, the tracks that started and stopped for no reason, the animals going quiet, those were things he had heard about before. He said, "I am not telling you what it was. I am just telling you what they say." I thanked him and finished the job and went home. That night I sat at my computer and looked it up. I read about skinwalkers. I read the Navajo word, Yinaldlushi, which I cannot pronounce correctly and which I have been told you are not supposed to say out loud, though I do not know if typing it is the same thing. I read about the beliefs surrounding them, the shape-shifting, the voice mimicry, the association with death and witchcraft. I read accounts from other people who claimed to have had similar experiences. Some of them sounded genuine, some sounded made up. I could not tell which was which, and I realized that if someone read my account, they might think the same thing about me. I do not know what was in those woods. I am not going to sit here and tell you it was a skinwalker. I am not Navajo, and I do not pretend to understand their traditions or beliefs. I do not think it is my place to put a name on something that belongs to someone else's culture. What I can tell you is what I experienced. Barefoot tracks in freezing temperatures that started and stopped in the middle of clean sand. A trail camera that was turned by something that left no marks. A voice that sounded like my friend, calling my name from a dry wash in the middle of the night, telling me to come to it. A shape between the trees that was the wrong size and the wrong proportions to be a person. Something crossing a road on all fours that did not move like any animal I have ever seen. A radio that picked up sounds that were not transmissions. I have not been back to that camp. I still have my trail cameras up there, or I did. I have not gone to retrieve them. I thought about it a few times, and each time I decided against it. I have other spots. I can hunt elsewhere. Brian asked me the following year why I did not want to go back to that spot, and I told him the area had gotten overhunted and I wanted to try somewhere new. I do not think he believed me, but he did not argue. Dale and I still talk about it sometimes, not often. Once or twice a year it comes up. He always says the same thing. That is not right. And I always agree. The radio is in a drawer in my garage. I have not turned it on since that night. The batteries are probably dead by now. I thought about throwing it away once, and I do not know why I did not. There is one more thing, and then I am done. About 3 months after the trip, in late January, I was at home on a Saturday evening. It was raining, which it does sometimes in Prescott in winter. I was watching television and eating dinner, and not thinking about any of this. The house was quiet except for the TV and the rain on the roof. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, a text message. I picked it up and looked at it. It was from a number I did not recognize, no area code I could place, no name attached to it. The message was 4 words. You should come back. I stared at it for a long time. The rain tapped against the window. The television played to an empty room. I read those 4 words over and over, and each time I read them, the air in the house felt a little thinner. I blocked the number and put the phone face down on the coffee table. I sat there for a while longer, and then I got up and walked through the house and checked every door and every window, making sure they were locked. I do not know why. There was no reason to think that a text message and a locked door had anything to do with each other, but I checked them anyway. I never found out who sent it. I changed my number a week later. When I told Dale about it, his face went still in a way I had not seen before. He was quiet for a long time, and then he said it was probably a wrong number or a scam text. I told him he was probably right. Neither of us believed that. Because the thing is, nobody outside of Dale knew about the voice in the wash. Nobody knew what it had said. Nobody knew the words, "Come here." Nobody knew that particular detail. I had not written it down anywhere. I had not posted about it online. I had not told Brian. I had not told anyone at work. I had told one person, and that person was Dale, and Dale did not send that text. You should come back. 4 words on a screen from a number I could not trace. And if you line them up next to the 2 words that came out of that wash on a freezing night in October, the connection is hard to ignore. Come here, come back, as if the conversation had not ended, as if something was still waiting. I do not know who sent that message. I do not know what was in those woods. I have read about skinwalkers, and I have read about other things, and I have talked to a few people who have had their own experiences, and none of it has given me an answer that I can hold on to. I have made my peace with the fact that I am probably never going to know what called my name from that wash in a voice that did not belong to it. But I am not going back, and I sleep with the hall light on now. I did not used to do that. I do now.